I'm going to wait just one more minute and give people another minute to join us, and then we'll start. Okay, we're going to keep the trains running on time. Welcome back to day 2 of the 4th Annual Leadership Conference. I'm Leah Teague, the Associate Dean for Baylor Law School and co-organizer for this conference. I'm now going to ask Stephen Rispoli to announce our door prize winner for this session.
So our door prize for this session is a Yeti mug from the Leadership Development Program at Baylor, and that is going to Lathina Gonzalez at Thurgood Marshall School of Law. Congratulations.
Wonderful. This annual conference is co-sponsored by the American Association of Law Schools. It's become our tradition for a different law school to host each year, and that school's law review or law journal will publish some of the works from speakers each conference in a special leadership issue. So it's our honor and our privilege to be the host for this year. Another tradition of our leadership conferences is to invite the then ABA president to join us to deliver remarks. Well, Judy Martinez was scheduled to join us back in March in our in-person conference, and she would have then been president. We're scheduled a few months out now, and so now that we are in September, her official title is immediate past president of the American Bar Association, but we are just so thrilled that she's able to join us. I know how packed her schedule still is. It is her long years of service to the profession that gives her the perspective to share with us some challenges and opportunities. She has practiced in law firms. She has been part of in-house counsel. She has volunteered years of service in leadership positions within the ABA, both at the board level and then so many committees. Also in her home state and in her own community. I know that she is deeply committed to public service and to pro bono activities to address important access to justice issues. I also know that diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are dear to her heart. Last week, as we were having a pre-conference to get ready for the next panel, the panel of our distinguished women leaders, and I was pulling up the website to share statistics from the ABA Commission on Women, which I often over the years I've used as a resource. She shared with us that she remembers the day that she was sitting on the floor in her living room and manually compiling those statistics that all of us for so many years have been relying upon. So she is dedicated, not only at the high level, but no task is too small for her to roll up her sleeves and to get busy. So Judy, we thank you for joining us. And I will tell you that at the end of this, we will have just a few minutes for Q&A. So if you have a question you want to ask, please send that into the chat and then we will get that communicated to her. So Judy, thank you again. And we ask you to join your perspectives on the challenges that the legal profession is changing and then the opportunities that we as lawyers have to make a difference in the lives of our clients and our communities.
Well, thank you, Dean Teague. I am delighted to be here with all of you today. I was so looking forward to being with you in person in March, in the days when nobody thought twice about jumping on an airplane or running into a friend and grabbing coffee or doing those things that the American Bar Association and AALS and the Baylor Women's Legal Society or other organizations at law schools do to work literally shoulder to shoulder on the causes that inspire us and call us to get involved. So while we miss gathering in person, one thing all our organizations and institutions are learning is a significant upside of remote events, both their reach and their opportunity to present for expanded engagement. What used to attract 100 or so are people at most of these types of gatherings, even webinars. Now we know they can exceed multiple hundreds. And when the pandemic is over, I'm sure that a lot of us will go back to some form of in-person opportunities, and those will remain always valued by all of us. But we'll also be able to involve so many more people through the remote tools that we're all becoming more comfortable with, and I'm sure even more effective technology platforms will evolve. Our additional reach and extended influence is critical for a very, very important reason. And that's the extraordinary amount of work we all need to do to make ours a more perfect union. Our organizations and institutions cannot do what needs to be done without the support and involvement of as many caring and dedicated people as we can assemble to do good. As leaders, we must insist on drawing from the richness and experience, intellect, talent, and dedication that only a truly diverse, inclusive, and equitable society can deliver. As members of a profession that falls far short of that aspiration, we have lots of work to do within our own ranks just on that score alone. A recent ABA report on women lawyers of color put it best. We have to make sure that nobody gets left out or left behind as they pursue a career of service in the law. We need to persist in figuring out how to eliminate archaic constructs that write off or diminish people's worth based on factors including race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, sexual identity, and differing abilities. Only our dedication to a truly diverse and inclusive legal profession across practice settings, on the bench and in the legal academy, its administration, and in the classroom will enable us as lawyers and judges to achieve equal justice and liberty for all those whom we serve, those who have no voice, whether silenced by a knee on their throat, the lack of money in their pocket, their inability to flee danger or tyranny in their own land and come to our country for safety, or those who simply are not heard because the color of their skin, the limits of their body or mind, or the person they love are different than those who make and enforce the laws. Yes, it's sometimes that simple. Working separately, each of us as lawyers and our organizations, whether bar associations, law firms, government agencies, corporate law departments, courts, or law schools can and do deliver valuable services and advocacy for so many whom we serve. But together, think about it, we are so much more. We are a force multiplier for justice, equity, and equal justice for all, for diversity and inclusion in our profession and the justice system, for the independence of the judiciary, and a vibrant legal profession that strengthens competence and ethics and serves the legal needs of our clients and the public. The ABA is the largest voluntary association of legal professionals in the world, and the choice lawyers make to join our ranks sustain that important status. Our members include solos and lawyers from law firms of all sizes, transactional lawyers and trial lawyers, plaintiff and defense counsel, prosecutors, as well as criminal defense counsel. We are in-house and outside counsel, federal, state, and municipal and administrative agency counsel and judges. And thank goodness, we have among our ranks many talented law professors and thousands of smart, committed law students and young lawyers. Given our diversity of backgrounds and perspectives, our members do not agree on everything, but we all agree that a foundation of good lawyering is a deep belief and commitment to the rule of law. Lawyers throughout America and the world look to the ABA and the organized bars as champions of justice, protectors of democracy, and advocates for the rule of law at home and abroad. Our foundation is built on the policies adopted by our 600-member House of Delegates, which represents bar associations across the 50 states and territories, along with ABA sections, divisions, and forums and other organizations. But with the involvement of our members, the ABA speaks for our constitutional values rooted in the authority of policies adopted by the House. Values like an independent legal profession that is empowered to give confidential, unfettered advice to clients, free from government overreach, and understanding that essential services in our community, include critical legal work that cannot always be done remotely, especially during a pandemic. Another critical area for our work is indeed for our profession is the ABA's commitment to an independent, fair, and impartial judiciary. Judges are at the front lines of justice and therefore can be vulnerable to attacks, both personal against them and their families. It is our responsibility as lawyers to explain and defend the role of the courts and the judicial process in our democracy. And the ABA also promotes judicial excellence and thus the independence of our courts through our longtime public service of evaluating nominees to lifetime positions on the federal bench. If we expect to earn and keep the public trust and confidence, and that we is all lawyers in America who are a part of the justice system, that confidence and trust will flow from a healthy supply of essential criminal and civil legal services. Our profession must evolve smartly and embrace change and innovation through thoughtful, data-driven regulatory reform, efforts that have been spearheaded at the ABA in recent years by numerous leaders of the bar, and specifically and critically, leaders in legal education. The fruits of such efforts are being borne out most recently in Arizona and Utah and other jurisdictions, which are looking closely at their regulations to ensure that they promote access to justice for all. The legal academy and today's law students, who will soon be tomorrow's lawyers, have an essential role in these efforts of reform across the country. We also need everyone at the table to achieve what for too many is a long overdue breaking of the silence regarding the truth about our legal system and society, the existence of persistent, overt, and implicit racism. As lawyers, we are a significant part of how the legal system has been able to exist as it does. We must pledge that not another day will go by without raising our voices, contributing our lawyering skills, and making it more just than it was the day before. Each bit of progress will clear the path to justice for all. So let us not say that the job is too big or the problems of racism runs too deep. This is our torch as lawyers to carry. Lawyers have a special responsibility to fight injustice, especially injustice caused by laws and practices that are racist and unjust in word or effect. It is our responsibility to fight injustice when police inflict disproportionate force against Black men and women, when people lose their homes and livelihoods and have no one to advocate for them, when caseloads overwhelm public defenders who are sworn to represent their clients, when immigrants and asylum seekers at the border are separated from their children and denied due process, when environmental injustices poison neglected neighborhoods and climate disruption threatens life as we know it, when judges are attacked because of what they are perceived to be or what they proudly are, when the rule of law and human rights are threatened, whether domestically or on the other side of the globe, when government leaders abuse their power, act illegally, and do what may be technically legal, perhaps, yet is not worthy of all that our country stands for. Yes, lawyers have a responsibility to defend what democracy is all about. We rely on and demand the free exercise of our most fundamental right, the right that Blacks fought for 150 years ago and women suffragists fought for 100 years ago, the right to vote. It is our duty as lawyers to give our full-throated support to this bedrock of the rule of law and serve as poll workers and volunteer as poll watchers and be community champions of the right to vote freely and fairly. The ABA, under the leadership of current ABA President Trish Rifo, is asking all lawyers, and especially young lawyers and law students, to serve as poll workers at a time when elderly poll workers need to protect their health and are therefore not able to serve. We're calling this effort poll workers-esque, and the ABA is partnering with the National Association of Secretaries of State and the National Association of State Election Directors to bring lawyers to staff voting sites across the country. Please visit the website ambar.org/vote to learn how you as faculty, practicing lawyers, and law students can participate. So why are lawyers especially drawn to public service and community leadership, whether to support the work at the polls or otherwise? We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. Those prophetic words were spoken in 1866 by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper at the National Women's Rights Convention in New York City. Harper was a freeborn African-American native of Baltimore, first a poet, then an activist. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, she told the convention. And society, she continued, cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest of its members without receiving the curse on its own soul. Harper was speaking of the exclusion of Black women suffragists by white women suffragists. Still, her warning that society cannot trample on the weakest and feeblest rings true for the soul of America today. So my question to all of you and to myself is that, will we dare stop the trampling? Can we muster the courage to intensify our protection of the weakest and the feeblest? I know the soul of America will be freed of its curse because of what lawyers across America and the ABA and beyond stand for and stand up for every day. Lawyers believe in dignity. We believe that every person in our country is afforded constitutional rights. We do what we do because justice matters. Those are the values we must reinforce each and every day, time and time again, in every class, in every lecture, in every student, faculty-led event, and in the hallways of our law firms. There's good evidence that this message resonates. According to the Before the JD research, the #1 reason students give for wanting to attend law school is that it's a pathway for careers in government and public service. 44% of students gave that reason, and they could list more than one. So the numbers don't add up to 100. The next highest reason given at 42% is a passion for the work. 35% said that being a lawyer would help them be helpful to others. And 32% said a law degree would help them advocate for social change. That message definitely resonates with me personally. When I was in law school, I learned that lawyers are leaders who can advocate for social change at a grand scale or change lives for the better, one at a time. And I am certain that every faculty member and practicing lawyer and judge at this conference has a similar outlook to share with the students who are attending today. The preamble of the ABA Model Rules of Professional Conduct lays out a lawyer's responsibility. Among those responsibilities is this telling passage, and I quote, "As a public citizen, a lawyer should seek improvement of the law, access to the legal system, the administration of justice, and the quality of service rendered by the legal profession. As a member of the learned profession, a lawyer should cultivate knowledge of the law beyond its use for clients, employ that knowledge in reform of the law, and work to strengthen legal education. In addition, a lawyer should further the public's understanding of and confidence in the rule of law and the justice system, because legal institutions in a constitutional democracy depend on popular participation and support to maintain their authority," unquote. This statement underscores that as lawyers seek competence and excellence in our profession, we also uphold and promote the rule of law and defend our nation and our values. It's the job of every lawyer to nurture the future members of our profession. And it's important for all of us to remember and reinforce for those who look to us as mentors that our profession is a calling to serve our communities and pursue justice for all, anchored by our constitutional government and the rule of law. Involvement in the organized bar is a fundamental way for lawyers to learn leadership. I hope you here today who are on faculty and in administration instill in your students the value of being a part of the profession through bar involvement. And I urge those law students here gathered with us to waste not another moment before engaging actively in the ABA Law Student Division and take advantage of what that free membership has to offer. And lawyer leaders with us today, whether in government service, legal aid, private practice, or in-house or on the bench, understand the value that ABA membership and membership in any organized bar at all levels delivers. If we together and individually hold fast to our values as lawyers, and if we join together and join with others who share our understanding of the criticality of maintaining the rule of law in our democracy and around the world, no matter how uncomfortable, risky, or sometimes lonely it can seem, I believe that our children's children will be told the truth about our time, that it was the lawyers who held tight to the principles that all of us are created equal, that we are endowed with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that justice was established and that the blessings of liberty were there for posterity because we, the lawyers, the lawyer leaders who are gathered here today, made it our calling, not tomorrow, but starting today, because we know that we are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity. We need all of you. And without you, we can't do this, but together we can. Thank you so very much for being here for this wonderful conference.
Thank you, Judy. Such wonderful words. And thank you for quoting from the ABA preamble. In all of our leadership efforts, that has become a foundation upon which we build. And it's interesting that there's so many, you'd expect it from law students, but so many practicing lawyers, they're unfamiliar with that language. So I think that is part of the problem that we in law schools, we can begin. If we emphasize that, if we start our students off with an understanding, this is who we are as a profession, then hopefully that will carry on into the profession. And speaking of one, I think we may only have time for one, maybe two questions that are come, but it's right in line with this. When you get to the practice, we all recognize, and you well understand, the pressures that are there, the time, the demands, the clients, the senior partners, all of those things in the mind of, in particular, a younger lawyer. It makes it difficult for them to understand, where do I find the time? Yes, this is who we're supposed to be, but where do I find the time? And then it's interesting when you jump ahead and when there are those who've been in practice for 20, 30, 40 plus years, as some of us have been, there's a point at which we recognize this isn't just about us. This is about giving back. So part of the effort of a leadership development program is to help our students learn that lesson earlier and be better equipped for those opportunities. So I think this is an opportunity for law schools and the bar to work better together. So do you have thoughts about how the bar associations and just practicing lawyers and law firms, how do we and law schools, how do we come up with some innovative programs, or how do we at least work together? How do we start?
Well, I think one of the ways that we start is with an awareness and acknowledgement of how busy lives are, not only with regard to those who have families and little ones they're trying to create a lesson plan around what they're doing at home now, but also those who choose not to have children or don't have children and have busy lives of their own right. We have to be so respectful of that. I think the lesson for all of us to work together is to help people understand that it doesn't have to be 100% all the time. And that whether you're talking about law practice or pro bono or community service of a different type, think about it as, like I like to think about it like nutrition. It's not what you get in one meal, or it's not what you get in one day. It's what you get over a week's time that's so critically important. And if you look at your practice of law, if you look at your pro bono work or your community service work, even if it's handing out boxes of food right now, which is so critically important, as a way for you to get fulfillment, as a way for you to give back, you can somehow seem to work it in and fit it into your life. And what law students, to answer your question, what law schools and bar organizations and law firms have to do is to be aware of that challenge and to make sure that they're making it at least a bit more easy for people to fit those things into their lives. Because with a fulfilled lawyer, I promise you will become a happier lawyer. With a happier lawyer will become a more productive lawyer. And with a more productive lawyer will come clients who know that they are being served with competency and ethics and dedication and commitment.
Oh, I so agree, and you're absolutely right. And so it's a value proposition. And I think it is important that we figure out how to help our lawyers see the value that is added, not just to them personally, but you're right, the health and wellness will create benefits that will last well inside and outside their professional life. But also it's that this will help build their practice. This will help build their reputation and gain skill sets through their volunteer work as well as their time. So speaking to that, again, coming back to oh my goodness, the pressures on the practice of law and law firms. Thoughts on how we begin to shift that value proposition and conversation about who we are as a profession and what should be valued in a way that allows partners to justify maybe some of the time away from billable hours, at least while you're beginning to build some of this. And this,
I started with a law firm right out of law school in New Orleans, where I'm born and raised. And I stayed there for 21 years and then went into in-house for a dozen years in the aerospace and defense industry. Went back to school for a year. And when I started to think about what my next move would be, I had no other thought but that I wanted to go back to that law firm because of their values, because of the way they had supported my pro bono work. I had done death penalty, capital habeas work, my bar work from my first year of practice. And that's where I wanted to be. So the value proposition for law firms, the partners who are in the audience, is understand what you're creating in terms of your value proposition to these talented, wonderfully dedicated law students who are coming into your ranks as law clerks or associates. And I'd say the same for judges, that you have that community of people you're building as clerks for leaders for our country for the future. And for law students, I'd say to look in that same way, to look at what that law firm's going to offer you in that way. It doesn't mean that you won't have to work really hard. It doesn't mean that you won't have to, quote, prove yourself. But part of being in a community at a law firm is having everyone understand what you're about, having everyone understand your whole person, and having everyone understand, again, that being a lawyer to you is about giving back. And if that is your commitment and that is your goal in being a lawyer, don't settle for anything less.
If I remember correctly, your year back to school, that was with Harvard studying leadership, am I correct?
That's correct. The Advanced Leadership Initiative, yes.
Absolutely. So once again, a look back at leadership and how that fits with lawyering, I think has led you to this true ownership, that volunteering, giving back, it will feed our souls, all of us, and will help us not only make a positive difference in the lives of our clients, but also within our communities. So with that, I cannot thank you enough. Now, you're not going away.
That's right.
You're going to be part of our women's leader panel. So we're going to transition and see you back in just a short moment. As we're making this transition, I do want to thank the Baylor Law Women's Society for co-sponsoring both this session and the next panel. And I also want to thank all of our sponsors for this program. Any of you who've put together a conferencing program, you know it's impossible without the support of financially and other resources, without the support of so many individuals. So we are, again, very grateful to all of our conference sponsors. I am now going to turn it over to Stephen. We are going to continue with our door prizes. And then after Stephen will be Professor Patricia Wilson. In kicking off the conference yesterday, you met Stephen and I, and Dean Tobin was the moderator for a panel. I want to introduce you to two other members of the Baylor Law faculty who are also part of our leadership team. So Professor Patricia Wilson will introduce the next panel, and then Professor Liz Fraley was part of a panel yesterday afternoon and will join us again at various times. So Stephen.
Thank you. We have a signed copy of Evan Thomas's first about Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and that is being awarded to Afton Kavanaugh from St. Mary's University School of Law. Congratulations.
Great. And now Professor Wilson.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to be part of all of this as we continue the 2020 Leadership Conference. Let me welcome you specifically to the Women Leaders panel. We are pleased you're able to join us, albeit virtually. I have been looking forward to our next presentation because I think we have a dynamite panel of very acclaimed women for you. Their complete and impressive bios are available on the Baylor Law website. So to ensure that we use our time wisely, rather than giving long introductions, I'm going to keep it relatively short. I will only be briefly introducing them, but I do encourage you to take the time to read through their bios. They are a very accomplished group of women. So let me start by introducing Melissa Essery. She is the Dean Emeritus and Professor of Law at Campbell Law School. Many of our Baylor alums will remember Professor Essery or Dean Essery from when she was a member of the Baylor Law faculty before she left to become Dean at Campbell Law School. Melissa does it all, from coaching the Campbell client counseling team to a national championship in 2019, to serving on North Carolina's Actual Innocence Commission, among many other activities. I'm delighted to welcome Dean Essery, my former colleague and my friend. Thanks for being here, Melissa.
Thank you, Pat.
I'd also like to introduce, although I think she probably needs no introduction, Justice Eva Guzman. Justice Guzman has served at all three levels of the Texas judiciary, the district court level, the intermediate appellate court level, and of course, she's a current member of the Texas Supreme Court. Indeed, she became the first Hispanic woman elected to a statewide office in Texas when she was elected to the Supreme Court in 2010, following her appointment to the court a year earlier by the governor. So Justice Guzman, it's nice to have you here as well.
Thank you very much.
Next, let me introduce Karen Locke. Karen is a regional vice president and associate general counsel at TIAA. Ms. Locke has enjoyed a full and extensive career spanning from complex litigation in private practice to government affairs in her current position, with many, many jobs and career activities in between. Ms. Locke has a passion for diversity and inclusion, which is borne out in the work that she does with nonprofits. So Karen, it's good to see you. Karen is a former student as well, so it's good to see you and see you doing well.
Thank you so much, Professor.
And let me introduce or reintroduce Judy Perry Martinez. You've heard from her already, and you've heard a little bit about her extensive accomplishments and the things that she has been doing. As you've already learned, she is the immediate past president of the American Bar Association, and she held a variety of leadership positions within the ABA for more than 30 years before becoming president. Ms. Martinez's leadership was on full display when, as bar president, certainly something she could have never anticipated, COVID hit. And she had to lead the sprawling organization, which you heard her describe just a few minutes ago, with some 400,000 members through the changes forced by the pandemic. Goodness knows, no one could have ever anticipated that. None of us did, and to be leading that organization at that time. And finally, last but certainly not least, is the moderator of this panel, and that is Jerry Clements. Ms. Clements is the former chair of the law firm Locke. Now, of course, she is chair emeritus. Ms. Clements has been recognized as one of the top 50 most influential women lawyers by the National Law Journal, and she is one of 30 extraordinary women in Texas law, recognized as such by the Texas Lawyer. One look at her bio will make it clear why she has been so honored and recognized. Her list of leadership positions, including as a member of the Baylor Board of Regents, is extensive and impressive. We are delighted to have her here to moderate the panel. So thank you, Jerry, for being here. Before I turn it over, let me remind you that you can post questions in the chat, and someone here at Baylor is monitoring those questions and will forward them on to the panelists to answer, time permitting. Shortly before this session is scheduled to end, I will come back to help wrap up this session, but let me stop talking and turn it over to Jerry Clements. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you very much for that introduction of all of these amazing women who are on today's panel. I am just really honored to be able to lead this discussion about leadership with so many outstanding women leaders on this panel. So I think we hopefully have some topics that will be of interest to you and can provide some insight from some extremely successful careers over the past few years. So I'm going to jump right into this and just start off by sort of building a little bit of a foundation to see where everyone has come from to get to where they are now. So I'll start with the question of what are the unique challenges that you've faced as a woman leader in your career or organization? And Melissa, I'll just start with you. From the academic perspective, tell us a little bit about a unique challenge that you faced and maybe how you dealt with it.
So quite frankly, it happened within 6 weeks of my becoming dean back in 2006. The bricks began ripping off part of our law school building, and it was found to be the building structurally unsound, which brought to the fore the issue of whether we should move the law school physically from main campus about an hour from Raleigh to the largest state capital without a law school, Raleigh. We're in Raleigh, which tells you the end of the story. But talk about pivoting. That wasn't what I had planned. We'd bought a house in Bowie's Creek. We'd already started the renovations, and now I began leading the conversation among faculty, staff, and students, the pros and cons of moving an entire school that had done very well where it was, but could do even better by moving. So pivoting, and that's a long story.
That's great. Karen, how about you?
Thank you so much for inviting me to the panel. So one of the big pivots that I did was to go from the traditional practice of law, doing litigation, being general counsel, to doing government relations. That was a big pivot for me because I knew and I had confidence I could be a lawyer. I just didn't know if I had the skill set to translate being a litigator to a lobbyist. And turns out they're really the same skill set. You're asking people to listen to you, convincing them that you have a good story to tell, and most importantly, could you do what is right and just, which is what Baylor taught me to do, 20-something years ago. So thank you so much to all the professors and deans that are on today.
Justice Guzman, how about you?
Thank you all for inviting me. And let me talk about judges as leaders. When you think about judges, particularly appellate judges, what comes to mind is leading in the jurisprudence sense, but the court has been faced with the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. So how do judges lead our state justice system in a time of crisis? So there are a number of skill sets that we're called to look for. I mean, you don't normally think of judges as your traditional leaders in the sense that you think about them, but it's learning to build consensus. It's learning from your mistakes. It's listening to the voices of different constituents. The emergency orders that we've issued work one way in one part of the state and another way in another part of the state. So I think we've been tested and we've learned, and we continue to evolve as leaders, leading at this particular moment in our country's history.
Well, as a Texas lawyer, Judge Guzman, I can certainly speak from experience watching what you and the other justices on the Texas Supreme Court have done to keep the court system moving as best possible during this pandemic has certainly been impressive. So that's an excellent observation. Unique, but certainly demonstrates the importance of having the flexibility of good leadership skills no matter what happens. So Judy, first of all, I really enjoyed hearing your presentation. You've probably alluded to some of the challenges you faced, but tell us, what would you consider your biggest challenge that you faced as a woman leader going over the last several years and going forward?
You know, Jerry, I think over and over again throughout my career, whether as a young lawyer and then as a commercial litigator, is asking myself the question, the challenge being put to myself. If I'm asked to take on something, or I decide to take on something, that I am going to see it through before I even start, and that I'm going to give it my best each and every day. And I think whether it's moving like Karen did from litigation to, in my case, chief compliance officer for a global company, or going back to school, that was a big move, or going back into this full-time ABA work the last several years. It's really about saying, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do it, you know, my best every day. And that's the challenge that I think we all have to put to ourselves.
Very good, thank you. You know, I get this question asked of me a lot, having been a leader in a law firm, but I'd like to hear your observations about what qualities women leaders actually need to develop. And in particular, how do we help, as strong women leaders, how do we help women leaders develop those qualities going forward? So I'll move around a little bit this time. Karen, I'll start with you. You have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Well, I think as a woman leader, our biggest responsibility is to reach back and pull up. I think that I benefited from a lot of mentors and kind of big sisters along the way who've really kind of helped me develop. And most importantly, were kind enough to point me in the right direction or nudge me when I needed some nudging. So I think that's critically important for us to do as women leaders, is to remember that we have a responsibility to build a pipeline.
That's a great point. I know I can certainly look back and identify 2 or 3 women who were critical to the successes that I was able to achieve. Certainly didn't do that alone. Melissa, how about you? What are your thoughts on the women leaders and the qualities that we need to help develop in those coming up behind us?
Well, first of all, let me completely agree with Karen. When I was a baby dean, I met 2 fellow female deans who to this day are good friends, and they mentored, counseled, and advised me. And most importantly, they answered my phone calls, even knowing it was me calling. They're terrific. And we owe that same responsibility back, as you said, Karen, to those coming behind us. I get to do this as a professor now, one-on-one, mentoring young women and telling them it doesn't matter if you're an introvert or an extrovert. You can be a leader. And it doesn't matter whether you have a title. You can be a leader. And letting them know that they can be uniquely themselves and lead and accomplish results. Do they need to have confidence? Yes. Do they need to see, as was spoken yesterday, where the puck might be going as opposed to where it is? I love that analogy. Yes, but those are things that can be learned. I think I've read every leadership book out there. When I became dean or before I became dean, I spent a lot of money on Amazon. And so we can learn some of these skills, but we owe it to each other as women to help develop female leaders.
Justice Guzman, what are your thoughts on the qualities that women leaders need to develop, and how do we help women develop those qualities?
One of the qualities that comes to mind is courage in decision making. Judges particularly are called upon to make decisions without the undue pressure of specific consequences, but with this greater goal in mind of protecting the rule of law. But I think as women leaders, we need to encourage each other to find that courage within us to lead in places that are difficult, or to speak up. Often I am the only person of color around the table, to speak up when you're the only person with that opposing view. And I think confidence was brought up. We should strive to build each other's confidence up. I had a call recently from a judge on a different court. And she said, I'm suffering from imposter syndrome. And we went through this. And it's just our role as leaders to encourage each other. And so helping address challenges that are unique to women. I don't think men run around feeling like they have imposter syndrome. I just don't. Maybe they do. But it's important to identify those things and to continue to work with each other to build each other up.
Judy, I'm sure you've had a lot of opportunities over the years, particularly through your work at the ABA, to think about this issue and address it. So I'd love for you to share your thoughts on this particular question.
Well, I'm totally aligned with Justice Guzman's words, because she said it right. What I'd add, I guess, is in addition to courage, maybe a little bit of another quality is grit. I see that as a little bit different. And I think women, and we have to help women just embrace the notion of grit is a real tool to be had in one's tool chest. And I also think when I was starting out in practice, there were not a lot of women around in 1982. And as a consequence, I looked to male mentors, and some of those mentors are still mine today. One is in his 80s, and I'm having lunch with him next Friday. I do try to do so every quarter. And I am truly indebted for all the things they showed me and taught me over the years. So sometimes we can look for mentors in other places. But what we have to do then is understand that we have an obligation to serve as mentors for others too.
Thank you. I totally agree with everything that you all offered. Those are great comments. You know, I know we've got a lot of representatives from law schools in the audience today, which is fantastic. I, for one, am thrilled that law schools are now thinking about how to develop leadership qualities and leaders through the law school curriculums. I've said this before, when I was in law school, we went to school, we read the cases, we learned the law, we learned how to be trial lawyers or corporate lawyers or lobbyists or whatever we became. But there was really no focus on leaders. And lawyer leaders are so critical to our society, in my view. I am really thrilled that this focus is now a part of the curriculum in law schools. So I would love to hear the thoughts of this panel on how law schools, in your opinions, can help develop leaders, especially women leaders, but leaders in general. So Melissa, it seems like you're a good person to start with on this, with your background in academia. So I'll ask you to give your thoughts on how law schools can develop leaders, not just lawyers, but lawyer leaders.
So we've heard yesterday some specific programming of leadership development, and Baylor has one of the best in the country. Other deans opined about theirs as well. So definitely curricular infusion of training leaders, literally as a skill. Judy, you mentioned you went to Harvard's leadership training program, and that probably impacted you greatly as a future leader of the American Bar Association. So leadership is a skill that can be learned. I think that in law schools, students have the opportunities through serving as leaders of clubs and organizations as leaders while they're in school. They get to lead others, and they learn those skills by doing. There's really nothing like learning to lead by actually leading. That is the best way one can learn. But I agree that it's been an oft neglected topic. And when you look historically at the number of lawyer leaders, it should be infused in all manner in our curriculum. I'll add one more point. We have a formal mentorship program at Campbell in the student's third year. It's voluntary. And we have a waiting list of lawyer leaders in our county who want to mentor these third year students. These are rich relationships, they're learning relationships, and typically they extend well past that third year and on into that student's years of practice.
That sounds like a great program. Karen, what are your thoughts about what law schools can do to develop lawyer leaders?
I agree with what Dean Essery said. And when I first went to Baylor, there wasn't a Asian American Law Student Society, and the law school really encouraged us to do that. They encouraged all of us to get together and provided, I don't know, some of the mailing out information and letting us post around the law school. This was obviously before email. But it's nice when you feel like you have that level of support and that the school is behind you the whole time. And I would also encourage the schools to think about, in the third year, trying to connect them to an alumni, just having somebody who's been there, walked in those shoes, and to be able to just coach them. Nowadays, you can be a mentor without physically even meeting. Think about what we're doing now during COVID. But just to be able to ask questions, just simple questions, is so critically important from the time you transition from being a student to a professional lawyer.
Thank you, Karen. Justice Guzman, do you have thoughts on law school curriculums for leadership development?
Well, I hire 2 law clerks every year from various law schools around the state, so I get to work with young lawyers right out of law school. But I think one focus could be this focus on servant leadership, and that's really thinking about leaders as having the heart of a servant and beginning to instill in these future leaders that this is a noble profession. It's not just a way to go out and make money. It's a way to have an impact on community. It's a way to have an impact on social change. And so instilling this concept of servant leadership through clinics, through any number of activities that a law school can engage with. And the other thing is tolerance. Leaders understand opposing views. And so often we hear or talk to young people who don't have the capacity to understand there are opposing views and that they should be able to think about what it would be like to walk in another person's shoes. So as law schools engage in this dialogue and this conversation and this leadership training, instilling in future leaders the notion that opposing views are what leads to the conversation, that leads to the change that we all seek. And I see that sometimes that it's a very narrow way of thinking. And I think law schools do a fabulous job, but we could all do a little bit more on that front.
That's a wonderful thought and very timely, of course, these days. So Judy, what can you add to the comments here about law schools' opportunities to help us develop leaders?
What I think I'd ask law schools, or will ask law schools, to think out of the building, if you will, to use a Rosabeth Moss-Cantor phrase, and to not only give opportunities for women law students and other law students to work within the law, but get them comfortable with becoming leaders in other circles. So whether that's going to a Chamber of Commerce meeting or a Rotary Club or some other civic downtown development type meeting, go have them sit in that, encourage them to do so. Have them be a part of a neighborhood team. Maybe it's about going and forming a team to build a Habitat for Humanity house together with local judges and lawyers in practice. Or maybe some other type of engagement in the community. I think those are so important to help lawyers understand that we are, and always have been, an insular profession. And we are now understanding how much more we need others to really go after these solutions that are going to be longstanding and sustainable for intractable social problems. So working together with other disciplines is critically important, and learning how to do so in law school is certainly not too early.
That's a great point. And coming from a law firm background, that ties in really well with what you talked about in your opening remarks about law firms need to really learn how to encourage their attorneys to be involved in many things and do it well in each category. So I don't think that's a perspective that law firms have typically had in the past. But I will say maybe the silver lining of what we're all going through right now is that the legal business is changing. Law firms are changing. I read a great article in Forbes this morning, you all may have seen it, about how the pandemic and the social issues that we're going through right now are really going to change law firms in ways that have been slow to come to the forefront over the last 200 plus years or so. So it'll be interesting to watch. We live in interesting times for sure. So let me go to a different topic, and one of my favorite topics, and that is lawyers and their ability to communicate. I know I'm going to ask you whether you think it's important for lawyers to develop, lawyer leaders to develop the ability to communicate effectively. I know you're all going to say yes, but talk to us about why developing excellent communication skills and a variety of different kinds of communication skills in lawyers is critical these days. Let me start with you, Judge Guzman. You have lawyers stand before you all the time and try to persuade you. What are your thoughts on why is it important to have a lawyer leader with strong communication skills?
That's a great question. And for me, the place to begin is that you have to be true to yourself. I have had the opportunity over the last 20 years on an appellate bench to listen to some of the best advocates in the world, the country for sure, and each one is different. And so you begin to think about yourself. Who am I? What are my strengths? How do I communicate most effectively? Who is my audience? What do I need to do to be persuasive? Obviously, learning to listen, even on an appellate bench, learning to listen to the judge's questions, learning to listen to opposing counsel's argument, to help identify how you're going to craft your own argument. And then I think you have to be intentional about it. I grew up poor in a family of 7 kids and 2 adults, and our conversation around the table, it was probably very different than my own daughter. I have 1 daughter, and so our conversations were very different. So we have to be very intentional about developing communication skills. They don't just happen, they take work. Find mentors, get that training to help you bring out the very best in your own specific style. Obviously, the typical things apply, audience, tone, strength of arguments, reasoning, logic, but that takes work. It doesn't just happen. And so it's a great question, and I encourage all of our audience to really think about and be intentional about pursuing what communication style works best for them. It's different.
So Karen, you've been in private practice, you've been in a corporate legal department, you're working government relations. All of those things require strong communication skills, but what are your thoughts on the importance of communication in leadership development and becoming a leader in our profession?
So the question that you're asking about communication is a two-way street. So generally in our line of work, what we're taught to do is to advocate. So we are in the position of speaking. I think it's equally important, if not even more important, to listen, just like what Justice Guzman just talked about. Listening to others is an integral part of communication. You're absorbing information, you're hearing it, you're processing it all at the same time. So sometimes when I think about the line of work that I do, when I'm in a deposition like I used to, or if I'm in a Capitol, if I walk out of a meeting or a deposition, I spent most of the time talking. I don't think I've done the process justice. I am there to advocate, but I'm there also to collect information. So when you're young as a lawyer, you want to be the one talking because you feel like you have so much great things to say. It's really important as you mature in the process to realize that listening is just as important.
Excellent point. I hope everybody was listening to that. Judy, you've talked a lot today about the ability of lawyer leaders to effectuate change. Does communication play a role in that?
Yeah, and picking up on Karen's point just now, I couldn't agree more that if you do speak, you should know what you're going to say and what you want to get across in terms of your point, and the other energies you have should be spent on listening. And one of the sort of a tip that I'd share is that before I give, and it's a little bit more difficult in these remote worlds and online worlds, if I'm in an in-person setting and before I give any sort of talk or whether it's a conversational talk or it's a keynote, I try to get there 15 minutes early, and I walk around the audience and people are just starting to gather. They may be on their phones for the last minute doing some emails or some other things, but I really try to go introduce myself. It helps me know the audience and learn a little bit about people. If I can meet 10 people, I'm happy. And it also helps me settle into the room. And I think that's critically important in terms of a communication. And when I get up, there are going to be people who are already saying, I know her. And I think, I know something about her and she came to see me. And I think that's important. Secondly, when you do talk, like Karen said, and use your time wisely, one of the most important things I think that you can begin to hone as a law student is the notion of story of self. It's the Marshall Gantz teaching. He's a former United farm workers organizer who now teaches at Harvard Business School. And it's the story of self, the story of us, and the story of now. And it's about what you're going to do in a very few minutes if you have the privilege and the opportunity to talk and when you're not listening, and how you're going to communicate so that you can help people understand their connection with you. So that's two things to look into, and as tips or tools. But I think Karen's absolutely right that listening is the most important part.
Thank you. Melissa, I went to Baylor Law School, so communication there through the advocacy program is especially emphasized. So as I said earlier, I'm thrilled to see the importance of developing leadership curriculum in law schools. But what are your thoughts on how we teach our lawyer leaders to become effective communicators when they're in law school? Maybe they don't come to law school with that capability. They're smart. They have the academic qualifications and capabilities. How do you teach this at law school?
Well, Campbell is a little bit old-fashioned among law schools, much like Baylor. We use the Socratic method in the first year, and we freely use it. And students must stand on their feet. Sometimes they're shaking, and we let them shake. But then they need to articulate an answer to the question asked. It may be wrong, but they need to work on that skill of speaking publicly in front of their peers. It has served me well. I was shaking in my boots in 1982, not my boots, but my shoes. But the process isn't necessarily an easy one. And not that every school needs to use the Socratic method, but to give students an opportunity to speak articulately, to speak persuasively, but also to speak to clients. I have the privilege to teach a course called Client Counseling. And in that course, students do simulations with quote unquote fake clients. And the first thing they want to do, and it's already been said, most of us as lawyers want to talk. And they talk and they don't listen. And so this is an opportunity for me at an early stage in our law students' development to teach the art of deliberate listening. It is hard for us to listen. It's difficult. How are you going to hear your client's story or others whom you serve? Unless you zip it up and really listen. When your mind may otherwise not settle into the moment, you've got to be in the now. You have to be present. And it's an interesting subject in and of itself, and it's been mentioned by everyone. I think it is a woefully underestimated skill that is necessary to be an effective leader. Artful, deliberate listening.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. The next topic I want to go to is one of my favorite things we're going to talk about today, because I've visited with you all briefly about this, and I've heard some really interesting observations. But I'd like for us to now turn to discussing based on your own experience, really, what type of leadership styles work effectively for women leaders. I know there's a lot of different views on this. But I think this is a really important question as we move forward toward the goal of helping develop women leaders and helping develop women lawyers who can become very successful leaders regardless of which path they choose. So let me start with Judy on this one. Judy, just based upon your own experience, your observations, what type of leadership styles have you seen that are effective for women leaders?
I say to be true to oneself. Don't try to be something that you aren't, or maybe that you see in somebody else and you're trying to be like them and it's not comfortable for you. It doesn't mean that we don't aspire to be like someone else, but that we make sure that we can own it, embrace it. Candor and honesty. I think a lot of women apologize too much, too often, and they start so many of their sentences with apologies, or maybe this won't work, or I'm not sure if this is on point. Drop all those phrases from your vocabulary, especially the word just, J-U-S-T. I'm just saying, I'm just going to mention, drop those phrases from your vocabulary. And I also think just the matter of, professionalism and ethics. And there is never a time that I've felt uncomfortable about being a woman who understood the value of well-placed emotion in terms of talking and listening to others. The art of empathy, particularly, is one that I think comes quite naturally to a lot of women, not all. And it is something that is so needed in our world, particularly today. And it is one that is often left in the briefcase and not brought and put on the table.
Great observations. Justice Guzman, what are your thoughts on this particular topic, effective leadership styles for women?
Every woman is different, and some styles, I think it's important to point out that we learn from our errors and our failures, and we may try a certain style and it doesn't work, and we find ourselves frustrated because we're not achieving consensus or we're not getting the results that we want. And so it's an evolving process. And as our audience listens to this, I hope that comes through, that you start one place and you learn from those failures or from those errors and you move forward. But I think a democratic style for women tends to work well. One where you build consensus, one where you validate every male opinion around the room, sometimes even let them take credit for the brilliant idea you just had. But it's more of a democratic style where you bring people together and you get them to see you as someone who stands for ideas greater than you. This isn't just Judge Guzman, the woman. This is someone who's standing for the rule of law, or for these ideas that are much greater than anything she could stand for as an individual. You stand as a symbol to others in your work. And I think that works better. I have not heard men described as much as intimidating leaders, but I have heard that description about women. So again, women, we have to be very intentional in how we approach people around us, or you are seen as intimidating or too strong or too opinionated. It's a lot of work, but in some, a democratic style seems to work well for me.
Thank you. I certainly agree with the consensus building topic that you mentioned. I think that's really important, not just for women leaders, but for all leaders, but that's just me. Karen, what do you think?
I agree with Justice Guzman about women having to be individualized. So there's not one size that fits all for leadership. I'm thinking back, reflecting on when I was a younger lawyer. I was a lot more hard charging, and I spent a lot of time telling people what they needed to do. And as I've gotten more senior in my role and more comfortable in my own skin, I have come to the conclusion that people will follow you more if you give them some type of say in the process. Just giving somebody a buy-in into whatever process or whatever project you're leading will give ownership to everyone, and therefore they're more likely to just go that extra mile rather than having been told that have to go the extra mile. But there is something to be said for knowing when to just draw the line, and that is something I'm still working on. Okay, this is it. I've heard everybody, now I've got to make a decision. So it's an evolving process, just like what another panelist just said.
No, I think you're right. So I think one thing that I learned during my 12 years as chair of Locke Lord was that leadership takes a lot of time. And particularly in a law firm environment or a legal department, because law firm environment, the structure is very flat. There's not a CEO with everybody floating down from that. So spending time with your partners, the communication piece of it, building consensus, and then actually making a decision is a time-consuming process, but I think it is one that really is quite effective. So let me ask Melissa. Melissa, you have, I'm sure, thoughts on this. How do different leadership styles work, and what do you think is the most effective for women?
Like others, there's no one size fits all, but I have an anecdote. Early on, I made a decision as dean, and it was my decision to make. And I received a very vitriolic, lengthy email. I wrote a tit for tat email late at night. I was right. Kind of like Karen, you alluded to a moment ago. I was doing a lot of talking in that email, and I had my husband come in. It was late at night. I said, would you read this and see what you think? And being a diplomat, ever the diplomat, my husband, he said, after he read it, that's really good, but I think you should sleep on it and see how you feel in the morning. Don't send it. I did not send it. Instead, and my heart was beating fast. These were in my early days as dean. I went up to the faculty floor to meet with the faculty member who'd sent this lengthy, vitriolic email. 6'4", former head of civil litigation at the Pentagon. And I startled him by entering into his office. And I said, and I don't mind saying his name, I said, Woody, I said, if you'll get the daggers out of my back, I want you to know there's nothing we can't talk about. And so we had an hour-long conversation across the table. I think, honestly, at that point, his chin was still on the floor because I'd had the gall and the guts to come up and, talk to him in person. At the end of our time together, I said, look, we didn't agree. We didn't end up agreeing, and that's okay not to have somebody agree with you. It's all right. We don't have to have every decision be a popular decision. But I did say at the end of our time together, and I said, please no more long emails, just let's talk about it. And so I became known as the dean not to send the long emails to, but to come talk to. And I think that helped me a lot as a leader.
I love that story, particularly the focus on one of the things we talked about earlier, and that is the ability to communicate. I don't think emails are the greatest thing in the world for that particular quality. And actually having a face-to-face, once we can start doing that again, of course, will be a very nice thing for sure. So here's a good question, I think, and one that's really important these days. And I hear this from a lot of our young associates or young partners who are coming up through our organization. How do we make sure, how does everyone in a law firm or an organization, on the courts, how do we make sure that women's contributions don't get discounted, or that our team members somehow, our women team members get overlooked? Judy, I'll start with you. You mentioned a moment ago on the communication side, just take out the word just. So part of this is, I'm sure, how we communicate, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on making sure that as leaders, that our women team members' contributions don't get overlooked or discounted.
I think the first thing we can do, and everyone here who's gathered can do, is to watch your example. I've been sitting here, Jerry, watching and observing you, how you have validated at least 1 point from each of us in your role as moderator. I've been on lots of panels. There are a lot of moderators who don't do that. You have done it with extraordinary effectiveness and grace. And you bolstered us, you lifted us by just your comments. So I think that's one of the prime examples, and I'll stop there. There's a lot of other ones I can give, but thank you. And if that's one takeaway that anybody has from this program, it's to have watched you moderate it.
My goodness, that's very kind. So thank you. I appreciate that. And you're wonderful to make that observation. That's very meaningful to me. Let's see, Judge Guzman, I'll go to you next. I know you have junior members on the court, you have your clerks, and I'm sure it's sometimes difficult for them to speak up when the entire court is convened or when they're sitting in front of you. What are your thoughts on this particular issue?
I think we have to make sure that people's voices are heard. And one way to do that, if a colleague didn't speak up on an issue, maybe you go into their office, like Melissa said, and you talk about that. And you say, can we send an email? Can I help you get in front of this group? And so we lift each other up by making sure that when one of us lacks the courage to move forward with a position or a vote that's not carrying the day, that we encourage each other to do that and find ways to do it creatively and constructively. And sometimes opinions change.
Karen, I know you have led teams over your career and continue to do so. What techniques do you do to avoid having somebody that can be very bright, but maybe is a bit quieter or not quite full of the confidence that others possess, who are willing to speak more freely? How do you deal with this issue?
One of the best things that we as women can do is to help other women. So for example, if you're in a meeting and somebody makes a point, another one of your female colleagues makes a point, but a male colleague cuts in or tries to take credit for that idea, the easiest thing for you to do is to repeat that point and say, I really appreciate that, Judy. Your point about X, Y, and Z, it's very subtle, but you don't have to confront the male colleague, but turn it around and give your female colleague or even a young associate or a young lawyer in the law firm that opportunity to, oh, wait, somebody else said my name, somebody recognized my point, and you have achieved both without confronting the offender, as well as giving the young associate or young female associate the opportunity for recognition. And it's simple, it doesn't cost you anything.
It's a great point, and I wish people would do that more often. I will say that, and someone mentioned earlier, having male mentors who have been quite significant role players in our careers. If we can also encourage not just women to speak up for other women, but men to speak up for women, that that really sends a strong message across the board if it's not always just on us to do that. So we hope that as law firms and organizations continue to evolve and have training on these kinds of things, that that will become a point that is pretty widespread characteristic of people who are bringing up new leaders. Melissa, do you have additional thoughts on that, whether in the academic world or the private sector?
Probably from my time teaching employment discrimination law and learning about implicit bias, where we know there's still, among other isms, sexism. And you mentioned training, Jerry. I'd be interested to know what your firm has done, Judy, yours as well, about the topic of implicit bias, meaning persons who might discount what a woman might say don't even know they're doing it, right? It's an implicit bias. So how do we overcome that societally? I don't have long enough to speak to opine on that, but that is a very real issue that we must tackle as a society. Racism, sexism, implicit biases that we all have.
Well, and that's a great point, Melissa. I know at Locke Lord, we are very fortunate to have another former ABA president as part of our organization, and that's Paulette Brown, who either has spoken yesterday or will be speaking as part of this seminar, which I'm thrilled about. Paulette serves as our Chief Diversity Officer at Locke Lord, and she has been talking about implicit bias probably since the first day I met her when we did a merger with her former firm back in 2015, I think. And so it's really great to have somebody that is focused on this issue within your organization with intentionality, and that is their job. Now, I know every organization, every law firm can't afford the luxury of having a chief diversity officer whose focus is just that, but it certainly has been a really wonderful thing for our organization, not just over the course of the last few months, but really for the last several years that Paulette has focused on the implicit bias issues and the training that goes with that. So I want to move to the next topic and keep us moving here because we've got several more things we want to talk about. This one, I'm going to start with Karen on this one for obvious reasons, but I know corporate law departments seem, in my observation and perspective, I may be wrong, to do a better job with diversity and inclusiveness. That's just my perspective, but I don't think law firms do very well on this issue at all, and we need to do better. But Karen, tell us about how corporate lawyers can support diversity in leadership.
Well, I'm very proud to say that my company, TIAA, really has been leading the charge on this issue many years ago, even before we started really recognizing and leaning into diversity and inclusion as a standalone department. Our company actually went out of their way to create an agreement with outside counsel that they must provide meaningful work for a woman of or a person of color or gender identification, and that yearly they would audit and provide a summary of what they have done, and they got graded. And over a period of time, that's how we were able to select our list of outside counsel. And that list is there for all the lawyers within the company to use, and they become almost preferred vendors. And then the only way for you to get to that level is to go through the vetting process, attest that you will do X, Y, and Z, and most importantly, have your feet held to the fire and actually do it. So I think the only way that we can see change is to come from all sides, but sometimes a little nudging doesn't hurt from your clients. And so the company, my company, is really very proud of what they have done in that regard.
And I will say, speaking from the perspective of leading a law firm who has been given the opportunity to make those kinds of changes by their corporate clients, it's a good way to effectuate change. Judy, I'm going to go to you because I know the ABA has done quite a bit in this area as well. But what are your observations, both about corporate law departments or your organization and effectuating change, improving diversity and leadership in law firms in particular?
Well, the ABA Center for Diversity and Inclusion is one of the most dynamic parts of the ABA, and certainly has available on its website for people to examine and to sign up on the Pledge for Diversity, which really puts front and center, as Karen said, a true commitment, whether for in-house departments or law firms, about what they're going to do to take concrete steps and give them the resources they need in order to assure diversity. We just finished a 4-part series with Dwayne Morris, in fact, and Paulette was involved, Black Lawyers in America. And we're coming out with a toolkit for law firms and law departments to follow up on that. But the constant drumbeat, it has to be. And I can tell you from my experience, 12 years in-house in the aerospace and defense industry that no one years ago thought would be as diverse as it is. I was at a company, Northrop Grumman, that was the C-suite when I was there, was majority people of color and women. The law department management team was majority women. And that was the way it was, and all of us were engaged. And it was a true commitment and integration of that commitment throughout everything. I think that's what it takes. I think it's going to take a lot more to get us to where we need to be. But in my book, there just literally is no excuse why lawyers across the country aren't leading on this on a day-to-day basis. There are so many resources available, such as LCLD that Robert Gray, another ABA president, runs, and the ABA, and so much more.
Judge Guzman, what have your observations been from the bench as far as seeing the change that's been effectuated by corporate legal departments?
Well, I start with the premise that diversity, I think, is an essential component of a fair and impartial judiciary. And when we begin to value diversity as something that is transformative for our justice system, then I think you begin to see real change. Right now, 23 state Supreme Courts have all white justices. And there are, I'm not sure how many Latina justices on state Supreme Courts, maybe less than 5, I think it's 3 actually. So corporate law departments have a role, though. You are the leaders in our communities. You have the ability as corporate legal departments to use your resources to bring awareness to the issue, to highlight the importance of diversity, to ensure that you support candidates that bring not only the necessary skill set, but that bring some diversity to the bench. So I think it's something that we do well in Texas. We can do so much better, but we work well with within the bars and within the legal community, within the corporate law departments, to highlight the issue of diversity, to put together conferences, minority attorney conferences, all of these things that we can do together to continue to impress on all of the stakeholders in our system the importance of diversity.
Well, and just for those of you who aren't from Texas, in Texas, we have an elected judiciary. And so I think it's really incumbent on all of us who have the ability to persuade women and people of color to run for our judicial positions. That's really critical because it's the part of the political process here in Texas, and I know other states do that as well. But we're thrilled to have Judge Guzman on the court. I will tell you, she is a fantastic representative, not only of the Texas Supreme Court and our strong judiciary, but she does so much for not only the legal community, but the minority legal community. And so we're very appreciative of that, Judge Guzman. Melissa, you probably have the occasion to work with corporate legal departments in your role at Campbell, but have you seen the corporate legal departments play a role in effectuating this change that we're all talking about needing so much?
You know, I have to confess relative ignorance on that topic. I will defer to each of you, in particular, Karen. I do want to talk about diversity generally at law schools, and that can be seen in our student population, where we now have, as of this year, 30% of our students are students of color. Roughly 52% of our students are women. Can we think how different this is, ladies, from when we went to law school? And when I began as dean in 2006, 15% of deans of the roughly 200 ABA accredited law schools were women. I was one of the 15%. That number this year is now 35% women deans. That's a lot of change in a very short period of time, 14 years, more than doubling. So, and many of those women are women of color. That hasn't happened by accident. And I think back to Judy's discussion of the ABA's dynamic initiatives in this area, purposeful, intentional steps to create the pipelines. Seattle University has a program every 2 years for women and minorities who are seeking law school leadership positions to help encourage them, to give them skill sets, to tell them they can do it. They can do it. And it's really inspirational to see the efforts of all of you in inclusion and diversity, and frankly, ultimately making our world and our society a better place. We have to do it. I don't think we have a choice. It's a must. It's a moral imperative.
So that's great perspectives from each of you. And it's so nice to have the corporate legal departments, judiciary, the bar associations, and law schools represented, because I think each of those areas have done extremely well in supporting improved diversity and leadership roles. And I think the area that still needs some work is the law firm. And we are continuing to look for ways within law firms to improve our diversity, particularly the number of our diverse partners, and to retain both women and people of color in law firms. It's very challenging. I used to blame it on corporate legal departments because, as Karen said, they would ask us to make sure we had diverse team members and associates and partners. And then we found oftentimes they would work with our diverse lawyers and end up hiring them away from us. And I would be very frustrated by that because we would always get graded on our diversity numbers. But then I realized I was looking sort of in the wrong direction when I blamed the corporate departments for stealing away our great minority lawyers and women lawyers and lawyers of color. And I started asking myself, why are we not able to keep them? And why are they even looking for an opportunity in a corporate legal department? We're doing something wrong in law firms. So I think that's a discussion that we really need to continue to have. If you are in law firm leadership, think about that. There's a reason that our minority and women, people of color retention rate is low. We really need to address that. I don't know, Judy, I'm sort of rambling now, but I know that's a topic near and dear to your heart too. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, we are not making progress. There's I think it's a 1984 article that was written by Robert Clayton, who was associate dean at Tulane at the time. Tulane's my alma mater. And, talking about the percentage of persons of color who were in the ranks of partnership, equity partnership. And it's not even inched up, barely a little. And that's, too long ago. And so that has got to, the article I think was 1994, not 84. The article, but we've got to make more progress. We've got to figure out what's wrong. I think we do know what's wrong. And I think we just have to have the honest conversations that have to be had. And I will suggest to you that the organized bar has in great part changed and made progress. And if the organized bar, those institutions of centuries, can do so, so can law firms. The ABA last year when I was president, there were 4 out of 6 officers were women. And of those, 2 were women of color. We just celebrated 10, the Trish Rifo, the president this year, is the 10th woman of the ABA. And in fact, we just got all together to do a video that I think has been posted on the website about voting rights, that all the 10 women, former ABA presidents got together. But it has to be, to use Judge Guzman's words, it has to be intentional. And on the ABA Board of Governors, to this day, even though we've reviewed it in 2 different decennial reviews of governance, there are still slots for women. There are still slots for persons of color. There is a designated seat for disabilities and for LGBTQ colleagues. And that was not taken away, because when we had that honest conversation, we realized that we were so fortunate to have those voices in the room, and we could not do otherwise in service to our members and the public than to make sure that those seats were maintained until it is no longer a question.
So just a little bit of an anecdote as well. When I took over as chair of Locke Lord, it was 2006. And at the time, I think there were only 2 or 3 women who were chairs of AmLaw 100 firms in the country at that time. Regina Pisa was one at Goodwin Procter. But I always joked, we had a big meeting in May that was sponsored by Brad Hildebrandt and later Thomson Reuters, and they invited all of the AmLaw 200 global law firm leaders to that conference every year out in California. And I used to joke that the breaks were wonderful because the line at the ladies' room only had about 2 or 3 people in it at the time. And obviously I was being sarcastic and not really funny because it was sad. When I stepped down as chair of Locke Lord in 2018, the line was a little bit longer, but not long enough. So I look forward to the day when at those kinds of conferences, there's as long a line at the ladies' room than there is at the men's room, but hopefully that'll be sooner rather than later. So the other topic I want to be sure we get to is one that I think is really, really important these days, because it's sort of on us, this piece of it. But I'd like for you all to discuss how we as leaders and people in leadership positions, how do we have conversations that are effective conversations, that are two-way conversations, that are listening and hearing and talking at the same time without making it either confrontational when it's not necessary to do so, but successful in our goals? How do we have a conversation about promoting diversity and change and improving leadership opportunities for women and minorities in the various respective organizations or parts of the legal profession that we are in? Judge Guzman, I'm going to start with you on this because I've actually heard you talk about this from time to time, not only in this panel as we prepared, but in other venues as well. And your thoughts are very good on this. And unfortunately, you've had a lot of experience at it too. So I'll start with you. How do we have those conversations as leaders to effectuate this kind of change without causing somebody to stomp out of the room, I guess?
Well, thank you for the question. I have had, over the course of 20 years on the bench, the opportunity to make a difference in a lot of areas. And one of those areas is the diversity or the composition of various boards and task forces and commissions. And what we have to bring awareness to the issue. And I've not found that part to be a difficult conversation. I guess along the way, maybe someone has said, well, why do we need diversity? Are you going to have 4 African-American or Black? And no. So we begin with, why is diversity important to this particular committee? Well, because they're making rules that impact people from all walks of life and people from different genders and people from different ethnic backgrounds. So you make the case, So you make the case why diversity is important then you just insist. I'm not approving this until I see a committee, a commission, a task force that's more representative of the people we serve. Not had anyone walk out of the room because of that. I think they're open to it. I mentioned an example recently where the board is, it's 2020 and the slate of officers is entirely white. Nothing wrong with that, but we serve a more diverse community. So it was a simple conversation. Have you all looked at the composition of the board? Oh my gosh, we hadn't noticed it. There hasn't been a Hispanic officer in the history of this organization. No one had noticed it. So it's important to have the conversations, insist on it if you need to, but most of the time people are so willing to make changes that are more representative of the communities that we all serve.
Thank you. Melissa, how does that look within academia?
Well, we have to thank the American Bar Association and the accreditation process, because our feet are held to the fire every 10 years when we as law schools undergo reaccreditation visits and reviews. And one of the accreditation standards requires us to use all effort to hire diverse faculty. I don't know when that accreditation standard came into being, but if anybody disagreed, there wasn't much they could do about it. So I'm guessing probably 20 years ago. Judy, do you have any idea when that?
I don't know the exact date. I apologize. But it's been quite.
But the good news is it's affected a lot of change, whether willing or unwilling. It has diversified, as it were, faculties across the country in law schools. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it absolutely does. Karen, what about within legal departments? How do you approach that topic?
I think Justice Guzman's right. Sometimes if you're fortunate enough to be in a position where you can ask the questions, then you should. It's your responsibility to ask the questions. And oftentimes you have to approach it knowing that maybe the other person that you're asking the question hasn't even thought about it. So don't walk into it assuming that the individual chose not to be diverse or hiring diversely or bringing somebody diverse onto the team. But if you're in that position and you're in a very privileged position to be able to ask that question, then you should. And that is across everything I do, not just in the legal department, but on boards that I serve. I want to know, have we ever had somebody who's LGBTQ? Have we had a Latina? Have we had Asians? Have we had African Americans? Women, you can kind of see just because of the composition, but it's difficult sometimes to tell just looking at a history of a roster, knowing whether or not somebody is from a minority group. And certainly I think you definitely cannot tell if somebody is LGBTQ unless they've self-identified. It's incumbent upon us to ask those questions because somebody helped us along the way.
And Judy, I'm sure you've had a lot of experience with these kinds of discussions. How have you approached it?
Well, looking to your firm and to Paulette, when she was ABA president, she really worked hard and put in place a requirement for all of our CLE panels to get approved. You need to have diversity at an ABA program. We had done that in the Young Lawyers Division many years ago, but did it informally without a policy per se. And I will tell you that I remember one time I was doing putting together a First Amendment panel, and I said, where's the person, back then was, where is the minority? And the people who were organizing it kept telling me, I was chair of the Young Lawyers back then, they kept telling me, well, we looked and we couldn't find somebody. We looked and we couldn't find somebody. And they came back about the fourth time when we said, no one will get reimbursement without it. They came back with a associate editor of the New York Times, as I recall, and like you can figure out, who that was. Paulette took it to a different level, and that's it remarkably so. And she made it a policy, and she made it something that was now everybody in the association leadership owned it. And I applaud her for that effort. And it has proven to be over and over again something that has improved the quality. It's improved the people we can reach out to. It has been remarkable in what it's done for the programming. And I know that is not ever an easy battle in any institution, because you're taking a slot. Some people see it as taking a slot away from somebody else. And I think one of the things that we have an obligation as women to do, and as whether we're women of color or not, is to never forget our colleagues with disabilities, our LGBTQ colleagues, Native American women, and to make sure that when we've done something like you've done, and been in a position, or I've been in a position, that at some point we realize it's time to step aside and let somebody else take it. And that's something that we don't see a lot in a lot of circles, and we really have to make sure we're doing that.
That's a great point. Just two observations. Paulette Brown is a force of nature, for sure. Secondly, just from the perspective of law firms, so many times in law firms, important leadership roles are decided by the person who has the most business, the most client revenue. And when you're trying to bring up leadership opportunities for women and people of color, that can be really challenging because, Judy, you alluded to it. There's an expectation of, well, I'm the next whatever. And what I found is you have to just sort of change that paradigm, and you have to go talk to that person and say, look, you're really good at what you do, and you need to keep going out there and bringing in client business. But I'm going to put this person in this role right now. And if you talk to them, they're always disappointed because we have this law firm paradigm of the big business generator is the person that's going to get the important roles in the firm. And so long as that's the paradigm, it's going to be very difficult for up and coming leaders to break into important leadership roles. So I just encourage any of you out there that are with law firms to think about that paradigm. And I know we thought about it a lot at Locke, and I was fortunate enough I probably upset some people along the way, but I really felt like it was the right thing to do. And sometimes we have to just do the right thing. And as a leader, know you're going to get some heat for it, but wake up the next morning and be like, damn, I'm glad I did that. I feel so good about that. So I encourage everybody, do the right thing. We know what that is. Sometimes you have to shake off those old customs, particularly in law firms. But it's great to see, and I'm very proud as I look back now as the former chair of our firm to see the women that have been coming up into important leadership roles. So I encourage everybody to do that. I'm going to stop talking. Leah, we've only got and Pat, we've got a few minutes left. I know we wanted to save some time for questions for this fantastic panel that we have today. So I guess I'll ask if there are any questions that have come through over the chat line, or how are we going to do that?
Let me jump in and ask one question. Jerry, I'm going to start with you because of your experience, but the question's for the panel. We talk about women leaders and what strengths and weaknesses perhaps do we have. One of the things that comes to mind is vision. And Jerry, I'm going to pick on you for just a minute because I knew you when you were with Morris Harrell in a smaller law firm in Texas, and then there were the mergers to Locke, Liddell, Sapp, and now to a global law firm. And I'm in amazement at how, and you were the leader during that. But vision, I think it works so nicely with the other pieces of the conversation, courage. I think sometimes women, we are afraid to step forward. We may have the vision, but how do we have the courage to really step forward, and then the gumption, the grit, the resilience to do what's necessary, especially as a woman lawyer in a still male-dominated and white male-dominated profession. So if you could speak to that, and then each of you in your own regard, without a doubt, vision in each of it ties back to your very first question about best challenges and overcoming them.
I'll just be really quick about this, Leah. I mean, it's one thing, you get the job, you get the leadership role, but then you wake up and say, what am I going to do with it? So I just knew in 2006, when I took over, we were a Texas firm that had basically 4 offices. I knew that the legal industry was changing, and if we were going to be successful, the firm, we had to change with it. And so mergers were a big part of that vision for me. Lawyers, as we know, don't like change. They hate change. And so pulling our partners along to accept this opportunity to grow our firm into what became, as you said, an international law firm with offices really all over the world. And now we have 23 offices. It just takes some time, but you've got to know where you're going before you start going there. So when you get the job, figure out what you want to do with the job and then go for it.
Others, who else wants to speak to that?
I'll chime in and just say, I think the beginning of vision is asking what if and why not. And I think it's so important to allow ourselves, particularly in the institutions in which we work, whether it's the courts or a law firm or an in-house department or an organization, to ask what if and why not, and always as a priority when answering either of those questions, to have the good of the public good at the forefront of your considerations.
I have a favorite quote: "Dream no small dreams, for they have no power to move the souls of men and women." So dream, envision, create, innovate. You can look at vision as identifying challenges, which may be problems, or maybe it's just opportunities that when you open up your mind, holy cow, as Judy said, we can do this. It's going to take some work. It's going to take collaboration, teamwork, grit, resilience, all of the above, but we can get this done. I will add one thing that hasn't been said here. When you're in the throes of leading, it can be so much fun. Can we just all agree with that? Right? Getting it done collaboratively with others. Oh my goodness, it's joyous.
And that leads to one more that is always, as a panel of women leaders, you're always going to get this balance. And Judy, going back to something that you said in your address, we all have seasons of life, and there are times where we have different perspectives and different priorities based upon what we were doing. But Jerry, I might ask, as y'all are closing out, if anyone wants to speak to that as well. And one more shout out, Karen, we had in the chat, one of your a law student that you mentored way back when. We'll send that message to you.
Oh, okay. I want to follow up though on your comment about depending on what stage of life you're at, your focus will be very different. And it's good for young law students to realize that going into the profession, that you can't have it all at one time. You can be a really amazing lawyer, and you can be an amazing wife, you can be an amazing mother, you can be all of those things, but it's really difficult to align them all at one time. But just be very thoughtful and recognize that, hey, there are all these facets of who I am individually, and I need to work hard at being good at all of them. But sometimes you have got to cut yourself some slack. We women are so hard on ourselves. Oh, I didn't make a 3-course meal every single day. I'm lucky to sometimes get takeout. And maybe sometimes we had this rule at the house, we call it Free Spirit Day. So Free Spirit Day at the house was a day when I just couldn't get it together, and you can eat anything you want and I won't say a word. Free Spirit Day, practice that.
And you know, Karen, about the balance issue and about not having it all at once, sometimes we have to look, I think, to places where we would not expect to find those answers and to find that confidence building. I remember being a young lawyer preparing for trial And the senior partner on the case, his wife died of mesothelioma and he had 5 children under the age of 14. And I can remember him walking into depositions at the beginning of depositions after that and saying, ladies and gentlemen, today is the day before David's birthday, and somebody has to buy him a present, and I'm the person. I'm the only one. This deposition will conclude at 4:30 so I can make it to Toys R Us by 5. No one said a word. And he taught me that it's okay to say those things. And I'm forever indebted to him that he taught me that it's okay to say those things out loud. We all have those moments, to your point, when we need others, we need support, and we have to be able to feel confident enough to express that.
Well, I want to thank all of you all for being part of this panel. Our time is just about up. Leah made reference to a comment that came specifically to Canada. It comes from something that y'all said at the beginning. And so I'm just going to go forward and read it because I think that everyone should hear it. And what it said is, I want to thank Karen Locke for being a mentor to me right before I started Baylor Law myself. I was an intern at the law firm where she was working. She gave me encouragement that I could handle Baylor and to be a lawyer. Thanks, Karen. And that's the importance of all of us in a position to mentor, to actually go forth and mentor. So once again, thank you to all of the women on the panel. This has been a fantastic discussion, and we very, very much appreciate you all being here.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, ladies.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you all. What a pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. We'll have just a short break and be right back.
Hello again, friends. We are about to get started, and I wanted to announce our next door prize winner. They will be receiving the Raising the Bar, the Crucial Role of Lawyer in Society by Talmadge Boston, who will be joining us Thursday and interviewing John Grisham, which we're very excited about. And like the other books that we're giving away, this one is signed by the author. And that is being awarded to Mary Claire Rizzardi, a student at the Georgia State University College of Law. So that's very exciting. Okay, without further ado, I'm going to open our next panel, and I'm very excited about this one. Civil discourse is something that is incredibly important to us at Baylor Law, and we know that it's important to law schools around the country. It feels like our country has lost the ability to engage in civil discourse. We have lost the ability to disagree without being disagreeable. So I'm really excited about this panel. I think this panel is going to help us through that discussion, help us think about how we can help our communities engage in civil discourse and try to avoid the impact of silos and social media. But I'm going to turn it over to David Gibbs in just a second, who is teaching leadership at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville College of Law. But I wanted to mention a couple of things about David before I do so. David was a partner at Big Law for nearly 30 years. He was at Nixon Peabody and then at Bowditch and Dewey before leaving practice about 10 years ago to come to legal education. Since he came to legal education, he's been focusing his efforts on leadership development and leadership development training for law students. He's been very active in the AALS section on leadership, and the section's newsletter would not be what it is today without David Gibbs. And so I just wanted to introduce him and thank him for all the work that he's done. He is going to be introducing our other panelists. And so without further ado, I'm turning it over to David. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I'd like to thank you and Leah and your amazing technical team for putting this together, and Bob and Ray for leading this panel. Since most workshops on reflective structured dialogue vary in length from a half a day to 2 days, I'm going to be very brief. As you can read from their bios, Bob and Ray are nationally and internationally recognized as educators who have taught hundreds of people and as practitioners who have helped communities and groups tackle the most difficult issues. As part of their distinguished careers, Ray is currently at the University of Georgia Fanning Institute, where she teaches, among other things, reflective structured dialogue. And Bob has worked with the Harvard Negotiation Project and taught at Pepperdine and Hamlin. Due to the overwhelming draw of this conference, we had to change the format to a webinar and thus cannot have breakout sessions to practice a dialogue. Please send your questions by chat to me, and I will distribute them to Ray and Bob towards the end of the program. Based on my experience taking courses from Bob and others and trying this method, including with my students who loved it, I urge you to think about the method and the insights in terms of building communities and resolving conflicts, in terms of teaching leaderships, and as a way that helped me improve my teaching. And so let's begin. Bob?
Great, thank you. David, thank you for those kind words. I am Ray Rawls. I am so pleased and excited to be with you today. As David explained, I'm at the University of Georgia. I'm faculty at the Fanning Institute. I do a lot of mediation training and training in dispute resolution. But right now, my passion is dialogue. Let me give you, Bob, a chance to introduce yourself and let's get started.
Sure. So I work in this country and several other countries teaching dialogue and mediation, and also doing work with divided communities, whether they're organizations, geographic communities, or countries. And we found that the basics of reflective structured dialogue work as well in a classroom as they do on an international stage. So we're hoping today to give you a basic introduction to some of the thinking that founded this approach, some examples of the work, and some of the specific techniques that we use that are very portable that you can use as you groom leaders in your law practice.
Okay, so I would like to start out by reviewing the course objectives. I guess we're going to put up the PowerPoint. Is that right?
Yep. Just got to share my screen here.
All right. Well, I'll start slowly. What we'll be talking about is the use of structure and agreements to support speaking, listening, and emotional self-regulation. We'll talk about the impacts of perceived threat on communication, because when we're talking about difficult conversations, we're talking about perceived threat. We'll talk about the conversational patterns that perpetuate division, understanding basic social needs using the David Rock SCAR framework, which I'm certain you'll enjoy when we talk about that. The place and power of preparing people for a fresh conversation, and the importance in how to create relational questions that lead to mutual curiosity. I wanted to put this in a leadership framework as was described. I work at the Fanning Institute for Leadership Development. I don't consider myself a leadership expert, but I understand the context of the work that we're doing. And we think at Fanning, the model that we most often talk about is adaptive leadership and I guess servant leadership to some extent. But adaptive leadership is a leadership framework that says individuals and organizations must be flexible and able to move and shift in order to solve wicked problems. The old days, I'm a fan of Turner Classic Movies and old movies where the leader was oftentimes the strongest man in the room who was really smart and could really tell people, do this, do this, do this, problem solved, life is good. Well, we know that that no longer works anymore. We are more connected with each other. There's more technology that keeps us connected in wonderful and awful ways. And we just experienced that one smart person usually cannot provide the requisite leadership to solve, again, what we call wicked problems. And so we use the adaptive leadership framework when I talk about reflective structured dialogue. And what I have noted in my experience, and I'll tell you a little bit about the work I do, is that the ability to convene, facilitate, and engage people in difficult conversation is an adaptive leadership competency. And if you lack the ability to bring people into a space by way of Zoom or in a dark, smoky room and get them to talk about staying in community in spite of their differences, then I don't know how you can really call yourself an effective leader. And this is a skill that's more important now than ever, and we'll just keep moving with this. And I'll bring in how the adaptive leadership competency plays into this. So we can go to the next slide, Bob.
Sorry, there we go.
No, it's just keep clicking to all the words are there, if you don't mind. So one way of thinking, my side, and of course, the wrong side, which is your side. Someone is right, of course that's me, and someone is wrong, guess who? There are objective facts, which are mine, and mistaken beliefs, perceptions, and ideas, which of course are yours. I imagine this is resonating with a lot of you right now. I want to weep, but I promise no weeping on this call. So let's keep going. Conceding a point is a sign of weakness. And even if I have new information, facts, I've read something that allowed me to shift. We're in a space where you're saying, you know, what I said 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago, I've changed my mind. People are looked on as being inconsistent, weak, losers. And so we stick with our ideas, even if we ourselves no longer believe they hold true. And conflict is a win-lose proposition. And of course, I am here to win. Your disagreement with me means you are, number one, you are ignorant, not in possession of all the facts, mistaken, gullible, and evil. And in thinking about how polarized we are now and the dangers to us, this whole idea, if you don't agree with me, you are evil. It permeates so much of our discourse now. I won't call it civil discourse. Another way of thinking, as opposed to my side and the wrong side, that there are multiple perspectives in a conversation, and that right and wrong are influenced by core values, beliefs, and worldviews. We construct our own reality before gathering data, and that is so critical. And I know some of you probably have expertise in how the brain works and some of the theories around this particular principle that we seek out with the confirmation bias. I only listen to the news or podcasts that align with my vision of the world. And if they don't, it's obviously misinformation. We also talk about acknowledging the other person's point of view can be both advantageous and wise, even if I don't agree with it. It could bolster me, but it can also give me a chance to reflect more on my beliefs around particular important issues. Conflict usually involves content and relationship. And I bet there's some mediators here in the room. When it may have multiple meanings, we talk about that in mediation all the time. The concept of winning can be more expansive. Our own piece of the jigsaw puzzle, when we add them together, we share them, we get a much clearer picture. I forgot to say, I'll say it now, that we're going to take some breaks where we'll check in with the chat feature. And David, I guess you're going to be checking that for us. If you see something provocative or interesting, give us a few of them and we'll tackle it. And then we'll do it again towards the end. And if someone is saying, Ray, Bob, you really have to answer this, you can get our emails, and speaking only for me, I will respond. And Bob's a good guy, so I have a feeling he will too.
That's a promise.
Okay, great. It's on you. All right.
Okay. So just to kind of frame this up in terms of, before we talk about a dialogic approach, I often think about, you know how when you're at a dinner, maybe family dinner, maybe family you haven't seen for a while, maybe a holiday, somebody brings something up that's political or something that's going to be controversial, the table, and you can feel that tension all around the table. You can feel people start to look around and figure out who's going to say what next. Well, that happens in organizations as well, where people are so afraid of fighting that they may silence themselves, or they may have a history of overt conflict that has affected what Ray talked about earlier, the relational side of what's at play in conflict. So a dialogic approach can help to bring people into voice about the things they really care about in a way that doesn't trigger other people into negative reactions, and help people have the kind of conversation that they want to have about the things they really care about, whether that's in an organization or in a family. This approach that we're talking about, reflective structured dialogue, by the way, grew out of a group of family therapists who were used to dealing with multi-stressed, years-long families and years-long conflicts that seemed intractable. And they found that by changing the conversation, they could actually change the relationships and the conflict. We've been at it for about 30 years now, and have found that this is very adaptable in a lot of different settings that are not family settings. So in a dialogic approach, I bring my ideas with an attitude of openness, that there might be other ideas out there that might actually influence me. I'm not going to be stony and impervious to the influence of other people. I'm going to be open to challenging my own assumptions. In dialogue, we want to create a space where people are willing to do that. they feel safe enough that they can hold their assumptions more lightly than they normally would. And also interest in learning about your perspective. And I do that by really listening to you, by listening to your experience, the meaning that it has for you, by asking you good questions that invite you to speak your truth. And ultimately, I'm hoping to create a shared understanding that is broader and more complex than the one that I started with. Doesn't mean we're going to agree, but it means that we can understand each other at a much deeper level than we did before we came into the dialogue room. So in this approach, dialogue is one of those words that has, many meanings, from a discussion on the street with somebody to the kind of intense and structured process that we're talking about today. For us, dialogue is a conversational exchange that is guided by structure and agreements that enables people to speak to be understood as opposed to speaking to win. It enables people to feel safe enough to listen, to understand, rather than listening to gather evidence to attack the other perspective in person. And really importantly, to develop real curiosity in someone who you may be deeply in disagreement with. And then the ability to explore that through the use of artful questions. I'm going to shift here to a video clip, and I'm going to ask for your patience. It's about 5 minutes long, but it describes the beginnings of the Public Conversations Project, which is the originator of this approach. And I want to show it to you because that project was born in the crucible of the abortion crisis. In the project, the model was created and refined over many years, dealing with the most difficult problems. And this little video shows, gives you a little bit of a guideline to those early years and to the process itself. And now we're going to see if I've mastered the technology enough to make it work.
You can do it, Bob.
During 95, 96, between pro-life and pro-choice.
Can you all see
the
that?
level of public discourse was
thumbs up. Good.
People pointing fingers and screaming at each other. You're a baby killer. Oh yeah, well you hate women.
Oh. And it was going so well.
My concern led me to sort of say, well, gosh, I wonder if we as family therapists have something to contribute for people who are stuck in disputes that just go on and on and on and on.
After we had started working, doing these abortion dialogues with citizens, came the big event in Boston around abortion, which was the John Salvi shootings.
On December 30th, 1994, John Salvi entered 2 Brookline clinics that provided reproductive health care services, including abortion, where he shot and killed 2 people and injured 5 others. The pro-choice people were afraid there would be another attack. The pro-life people were afraid there would be a retaliatory attack against them.
In response to that, 3 pro-life leaders and 3 pro-choice leaders started meeting with PCP, and that continued until they'd been meeting for a period of about 5 years. The concrete result was that there was less violence, that when people proposed coming to town to kind of rally up on one side or the other, these women discouraged them and said, that's not welcome here. We're looking to reduce polarization. We're looking to reduce violence. We're looking to reduce rhetoric.
What we did, even though we weren't intending to do it, it's what we did, was to develop a really versatile methodology for engaging differences, particularly differences involving values and worldviews, that has transferred across different issues and then different cultures.
For me, the revolutionary thing was the idea that you can actually shape and structure a conversation in an intentional way.
If you want to change a dysfunctional conversation, you have to create an environment in which people feel safe enough to be able to listen differently and to be able to speak their strongly held views in ways that don't simply piss off or alienate they or injure the other party.
What the folks from PCP did for us in all of the instances, just where it was, first of all, establish a structure that enabled us to speak fairly and openly and honestly by knowing that there were rules and expectations about how to dialogue and giving us the tools through those rules, that structure. And then by very gently and very lovingly, yet very firmly and appropriately, making sure that we all held to those rules, no matter what circumstance we were in.
So they can be profoundly opposed and yet connect with respect and with genuine curiosity.
One most interesting thing for me in the training was that courage that participants had, especially those who were victims, to build the courage to be able to share the stories with one another in that open way, where we had some who were ex-combatants seated and victims were able to share their stories and we felt safe.
Part of what I think PCP has to offer to the world is a space in which it feels safe to speak about what is most important to you in a way that you can be heard. I can disagree with you and I can like you, and I can advocate passionately against you on that issue and still live with you as a neighbor, as a member of my community.
We want peace, oh, no more. We want peace, no more. We want peace, oh, no more.
Okay. Now we'll see if we can get back to PowerPoints. Okay. The PowerPoint back up on the screen. Can somebody outside give me a thumbs up? Okay, great.
Yes.
So you've just seen a couple of examples of extreme polarization that this model was forged in. One is abortion, and the other was an example of bringing ex-combatants and victims together in Liberia after their civil war. I wanted to show this to show you how robust this approach is. And it's well suited for engaging people who are mired in polarization, whether that's polarization writ large, like we have in our country right now, or whether it's something as small as a conflict that starts in an organization and people start to take sides in interest groups. And as they do that, they start to maximize the differences across that divide and minimize the differences among themselves. And pretty soon, when you get to the top of that diagram, there is no way that people can communicate with each other because every communication is suspect. Every communication is deemed fake by the other side and riddled with misinformation. So we have to do something to bring people back down from the level of separation to the level of experience, where you can see at the bottom of that diagram, people are living, perhaps you can't see the multiple colors, with various beliefs, values, identities. They're living in their complexity until threat comes into their world and starts to entice people to separate. And it's that situation that we have engaged in many different ways, from something as small as a house of worship to as large as a state or country. And Ray's going to tell us a story that she's been involved in engaging polarization out in the field.
Okay. So actually, we'll tell maybe 2 or 3 stories, Bob. So I'm public service faculty at the University of Georgia. So my students are primarily out in communities. I do a lot of work with elected officials, chambers of commerce leaders, community leaders. Love it. I also do work at the law school, primarily supporting their mediation programs. I've been teaching mediation for quite some while. But I wanted to share a couple of stories about some dialogues that I have had in the field a couple of years back and even more recently. This one talks about a university in the Deep South. I'm from Atlanta and from the Deep South, so I'm comfortable in owning that, of course. And I was there to actually facilitate a dialogue around guns on campus. Now, I have been a mediator and a facilitator for many, many years, and I have learned how to pack up my beliefs and put them in a box and enter that space where I'm to be a neutral facilitator with the idea that everyone there has a point of view, and my role is to create a space for them to share their differences. But I do have my own opinions, and I have to say, being on campus, the opinion that I packed up was that anybody who supports guns on campus is a little nutty. I won't do the evil and all the other stuff, but I just don't understand that perspective. At UGA, I guess last year we had a kid shoot himself in the leg in a chemistry class. I'm going, oh dear Lord. In that class that I'm facilitating the dialogue around guns on campus or firearms on campus is a physics professor. And I always point out his expertise because I'm always impressed by people who do physics. And he talked about a gun being an extension of his arm, and that he told wonderful stories about taking his gun to school in high school because on the way home he might be able to get dinner for the family. And he talked about the events that his family did to stay connected. They would go hunting and that kind of thing. And I thought, you know, that's kind of interesting. My family was a little different. My parents met at 2 of the historically Black colleges in Atlanta. So their idea of family fun was plays and movies and that kind of thing. And for the first time, I became consciously aware of, wait a minute, this guy thinks that a gun is the extension of the arm, but he's not a bad person, and I don't perceive him as being evil or misinformed. So I felt myself shift a little. During the conversation, I saw him jump. I mean, like literally in the chair. And after we did the dialogue, I went to him and said to him, I saw you jump. What happened? And he said to me, I've always said that I think of a gun as an extension of my arm. And I can argue all the amendments and everything else, but for the first time in my life, as a result of what I heard in this space, I thought about 3 of my colleagues that if I saw them enter a building with a weapon, I would not enter the building and would encourage other people not to enter the building. And so what he described to me was a shift as well. And I tell that story because it kind of underlies my belief that when you listen to other people's stories, there are incredible opportunities for learning and growth and connection. Do not hear me saying I believe we need to have guns on campus. I don't. And I imagine he's still in very similar situation. But the idea of hearing another perspective, leaning into another perspective, I say to a lot of people, he and I would be the best people to go to a meeting that's developing gun policy because of that tiny shift that we both took, our learning and growing and understanding that our beliefs aren't absolutely correct. There are spaces around them. I think that's important. One of the things we do a lot of work in the classroom, Bob does, I do. Classrooms now are so fraught. I'm collecting articles. The professor at Emory Law, who is, I'm not sure what his status is now, but got in trouble. He was reading something in class and he used the N word and it just blew up, and all the American Bar Association is involved. This morning I read about the communications professor out in California who was talking about pausing and had done some work in China and learned that Americans, when we need to think, we go, we make sound. The sound that he indicated was made by the people in China was nega, nega, and he said, and some of the African American students just blew up and they were deeply offended. The word sounded like the N word to them, and he is potentially out of a job. I was the assistant dean at Georgia State's law school many years ago, and I remembered some of the students coming to me deeply offended because the constitutional law professor used the word niggardly. And I love history, I love Canterbury Tales, and was familiar with it. And I told them, no, go, before you come in here filing a complaint, find out what's going on. So we do a lot of work with assisting professors and teachers how to create a space, and when those things show up in the classroom, people are prepared to deal with. And the first solution isn't to protest and go report, but to say, we need to have a conversation here about that. That statement was problematic and we need to do something with it. I'm doing dialogues on Confederate monuments all over Georgia. What bathrooms do people use? How old does a child have to be before he or she can decide decide what bathroom is appropriate? So the thing that I love most about this is that I don't see any place where it's not appropriate to learn these skills and use them. Let me talk about, Bob, I don't know, I said I'll give you an opportunity to share some stories. I want to do that, true to my word.
Sure. Well, there's one, actually, one quickie that relates to what you just said that just came up in academic setting that I thought I'd throw in there in terms of creating the space for conversation. Another one about an organization quickly. So here's something that was just said in an academic setting. Master narratives and hermeneutics, religious and otherwise, too easily slip into white male heteronormative musings, discourses, and paradigms. So this is said in a mixed group of multiple mixings in a class setting. And the question is, what do you do next? What do you do with that? How do you create a space where after that's been said, you can have a constructive conversation? And that's what you're going to be learning about in the next hour or so. But just a quickie organization example. I worked with a large city's community mental health, total care for the entire city. It was headquartered in a hospital. There were clinics all over, one of the poorest cities in the country. And budgetary decisions in the executive team had come to a grinding halt because the people that ran the clinics felt that the hospital was hoarding all the money, and the clinics were out in communities of color, and the hospital administrators were mostly white. So there was suspicions of racism around decisions having to do with money, but no way to discuss it. And so they were really at an impasse. Through a dialogue process that lasted about 3 months, they were able to let go of some of the stereotypes that they had about each other. And what we talked about earlier about holding your assumptions lightly, they were able to do that and to be able to see each other in a much more complex way and see a lot of the other factors that were involved in the decision-making on the hospital side and also in the concerns on the clinic side. And they were able to come together in the end, cobble together a budget to get through the next year, and more importantly, heal the relationships that had prevented them from having the conversations they needed to have in order to continue to get business done. I think that's it, right?
Okay. So if we can keep moving, I will continue to share a story. So the goal of reflective structured dialogue, fondly known by us as RSD, is to pursue mutual understanding rather than agreements or immediate solutions, which oftentimes drives people nuts. We hired you to come up with a solution to the problem. Well, that can come after we understand perspectives that are different from our own. And we find out that the goal being mutual understanding creates a space for all kinds of wonderful things to happen. So, and you can hit it a couple times for me, Bob. A good dialogue offers participants a chance to listen and be listened to with care. Speak and be spoken to with respect. And I am currently engaged in dialogue with members of the Black Lives Matter movement and law enforcement in another state. And one of the things we've heard from all sides, there's no both sides to it, that this is the first time that we have had to listen to each other with care and respect, and how hard it is and how difficult it is and how important it is to have a strong facilitator who will say, you violated the rules. At the clip you saw, the rabbi mentioned that having a facilitator who holds people in the container that they have voluntarily entered, how important that is. To learn about the perspectives of others, me hearing about everybody who thinks that guns are firearms on campus, which was the issue that we were there to talk about. Learn about the perspectives of others is critical. I'm getting distracted by the chat. I have to remember, don't do that, Ray. And even more powerful, to reflect on one's own views. And I want to talk about that a little bit. Dave Joseph, the first person you saw in the video clip, tells the story about an abortion dialogue that he did, where there was an individual, a woman there who said that a woman has an absolute right to decide what to do with her body. Absolute. This is it in the conversation. In the dialogue, we asked a question that gives you the opportunity to reflect on your own perspective. And it's about, we ask you, what are your gray areas? Where are you less certain about your point of view? And he tells the story of her saying, I'm just afraid. I believe a woman has an absolute right to decide what to do with her body, but I have a fear that one day they will locate a gay gene and we'll see a holocaust of unborn gay children. So in that space, there was a little bit of, I'm absolutely, almost absolutely certain that the space I hold is the right space. And if you're in a room, on the Zoom call, whatever, and you see people honor their uncertainty, their gray areas, all of a sudden you can really feel the leaning in and the idea that there may be some possibilities there. Maybe I can learn and grow. Maybe I can shift. Maybe I won't shift, you won't shift, but we can stay in community together. And the fact that you have that sign in your front yard will no longer make me feel that I don't deserve to be in this community, or this community doesn't deserve to have me. So we know that significant shift happened as people began to try to understand the views of others and more closely reevaluate and monitor their own. Is there a way I can stop looking at these chats? I'm telling you, oh, you all asking such amazing questions. I cannot look. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the structure of RSD. The sequence questions, and we spent a lot of time on questions. We have 3, which I call standard questions that oftentimes lead to are used in the first dialogue. The first question relates to your own, a story, a life experience. Ray, what is your life experience around that informs your beliefs around guns on campus? And I love that question, experience, perspective, complexity. Then the second one is, what's at the heart of the matter for you? When you think about your perspective on this issue, when you look into your own soul and spirit, what rises up? My belief that this is the most important value that I hold. And then the complexity is what I talked about, the gray area, when you get a chance to revisit and rethink about your own point of view. And the power of that I've been doing this work for many, many years, and I'm still amazed by the power of the structure that we create. There's order. When we're in the space, we intentionally put, for example, I would put law enforcement, Black Lives Matter, community law enforcement, so that as we go around in the circle, we begin very early on to hear different experiences and different narratives. On Zoom, it's a little more challenging, but I think we're mastering that. I don't see us spending a lot of time trying to figure out what perspective someone brings to the table, but I imagine that's still equally important, and we need to figure that out. I don't know, Bob, you've done some, is that something you all think about on the Zoom calls?
If I know in advance, if I'm doing a dialogue project, yes, I write it down, you know, who's going to go when and where, and I try to alternate perspectives when I'm talking to folks. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm glad I asked that, because yeah, trying to make this real, make these connections in a virtual world. I'm finding that it can be done, but we need to talk to each other and exchange ideas. The right to pass, which is a lot of people find interesting. You enter that space and you have the absolute right to pass, which means I don't want to respond to that question, or pass for now, meaning come back to me when everyone else has spoken. So I get pushback sometimes from folks say, well, if you were going to pass, why are you here? My experience has been when people have the right to pass, or pass for now, they seem to more fully engage. And I think when Bob, when you talk about how the brain works, that you'll get some understanding of that.
Yeah, can I throw 2 cents in on that?
Absolutely.
There's a lot of suspicion sometimes about dialogue, both from the left and the right. But what is common in that suspicion is that people worry that they're going to be manipulated in some way, that they're going to be somehow inducted into saying something they don't want to say. So sometimes one of those folks will show up and they'll just pass. And the pass is a test. It's a test of us to see if we're really going to stick with it, if it's really that they can really be safe from being bullied or manipulated by other people in the room. So we feel that that's a really, really important thing, foundation upon which a lot of the rest of the stuff is built.
At the end of the questions, be they 2 or 3, individuals are invited to ask each other questions of genuine interest. And that may sound a little more simple than it actually is. Asking that question, say, for example, with the Black Lives Matter, the one mother whose son was shot by a police officer talked about the struggle of asking a law enforcement officer a question of genuine interest. And she struggled beautifully with it because she really wanted to engage in these conversations and felt that until we come together as a community, law enforcement and other community members, we were all in danger. And it can be very fun and funny, but how do you ask someone a question to really understand their perspective, which is a lot more challenging, of course, when you don't believe they honor your humanity, that they see your value. But asking those questions and hearing the responses can lead to extraordinary connection. And I've seen that in a lot of the work I do. And a lot of coaching for some groups and helping them ask those kinds of questions, not the one where the question on a scale of 1 to 10, we talked about that, about how racist are you?
Yeah.
And which is not a question of genuine curiosity. So we struggle against those kinds of questions. And then we ask a closing question, which is oftentimes something like, what did you do or hold back, refrain from doing in order for this conversation to go as it did? Bob, do you have other closing questions? I mean, that's kind of our standard question.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of dialogue work around COVID lately, and particularly with healthcare workers. And it's been very, very interesting, very rewarding. But the closing question that we've been using there is, what are you taking with you? What do you want to take with you as you leave this group experience today? And it tends to be a very, very profound. One person said, this is the first place for healing that I've found since COVID started. And I want to hold on to that. Not too bad.
Not too bad at all. Other parts of the structure reflect, write, speak, which is drive some people crazy when we request them to think before they speak. As I said, I deal with a lot of community leaders and love them and respect them, but the pushback from people, I already know what I'm going to say. And I thank you, your honor, your worshipfulship, whatever your title is. Did it ever dawn on you other people might appreciate the opportunity to reflect before they speak? So we ask the question. You may have 2 to 3 minutes to think about it, take some notes, and 2 to 3 minutes to speak about it.
Hey, Ray.
Yes.
This might be a place, you talk a lot about the power of pausing. And I wonder if this might be a place for you to say something about that.
Okay, now, all right. So I can move it up because it's on this slide.
Sorry, it's on there. I can't see what all's on the slides until they comes up on the slide. So
okay, well, I think I can do that. So so reflect, write, speak. I'm going to talk. Yeah, just keep clicking. We'll get there. Time limits and go. Time limits and go round structure, and so everyone knows when it will be your turn, how much you will have to talk, and we'll talk about the communication agreements as well. The power of the first speaker. A colleague of mine said she went somewhere to a faculty retreat, and they did introduction, and the first person talked about ultimate frisbee, and after that, everyone's introduction involved ultimate frisbee. So the first speaker in that space became so powerful, he formed everyone's response to the question. In this approach to conversation, each and every one is the first speaker because you've already thought about what you were going to say. Some of you took notes and you get to speak, and we don't allow you to piggyback on someone else, and we'll talk about that later. But everyone is the first speaker. And the pause. This, for some groups, feels kind of hokey, but it is so powerful, particularly in when people are actually in the room. I'm still looking at it in terms of a virtual space because there's kind of a pause anyway. But hopefully in a few months we can get back to our old lives to some degree and can be in spaces with people. But the pause means that after one person completes his or her or their comment, we ask that you breathe. I say 2 breaths. I've heard different things, but that there is an intentional space between the last speaker and you. The neuroscience says that this pause reduces reactivity and prepares an open space for the next speaker. And again, Bob is going to talk a little bit about that. But I've heard people say, oh, that's so hokey. But then we do it and people say, I love this. I learned so much. And the pause was so incredibly powerful. And thank you for introducing that into our conversation. It really shifts the dynamics. And if you're in a room and there's a lot of pain and anguish, or maybe even joy, and it's just some things that need tweaking, following this structure, including the pause, can really change the dynamics in the room so you can talk about virtually anything. I'm handing it back to you, Bob.
Oh, okay. So speaking of reducing reactivity, I want to talk a little bit about some of the thinking that informs this approach, both from really, really basic neuroscience and also some thinking from communication theory. Well, let's start with some of the brain research. I really enjoy the work of Rick Hansen, mostly because he writes in a way that I can understand as a non-scientist and a non-physician. He wrote a book which, normally if a book has happiness in the title, I have to say I'm not going to read it, generally speaking. And this book is called Hardwiring Happiness. But it's all research on interpersonal neurobiology. What do we know about the brain in terms of how we interact with each other? And Hansen talks about the brain being Velcro for the bad and Teflon for the good. That is, because of evolution, we've developed very fine sensitivity to danger. And we hang on to evidence of danger when it's there. And the good stuff tends to roll off, and that can be with regard to ourselves or other people. We're much more prone to seek and hold on to the negative. And I think that's one of the reasons why negative campaigning works so well in our elections. The result of that is what I just referred to as negativity bias, but also reactivity. We're more likely to be reactive rather than conscious and responsive when in the space of feeling threatened. But just pause with me for a minute and think about a time when somebody said something to you that you felt was really threatening to your sense of identity, of one of your identities, whatever that might be. Somebody says something and bang, you feel that sense of threat. Think about that for a minute. The neurobiological researcher Dan Siegel says the first evidence that we have of something outside of us is through our body. That the first evidence that we have of threat is how our body feels and what starts to change in our body. And then it starts to shape what comes after. It shapes our cognition, our perception, our emotion, the decisions that we can or can't make, the access that we have to resources, and the responses that we make to the person that's the source of that threat. And when we're in that threat space, we're less likely to be conscious of the mechanisms by which we make meaning of the environment that we're in. I'm sure that most, if not all of you, have seen this diagram, the ladder of inference, which was originally created by Chris Argyris at Harvard Grad School of Education. And it gives a basic view of how we make meaning in the situations that we find ourselves in. I want to just quickly run over this with you. because it does figure prominently into this approach, the understanding does. The idea is that if you look at the bottom pool, I would say, rather than available data, I would say the pool of experience that we're in with a given group. And we can't pay attention to everything. It's impossible for us to do that. So we have to decide what to pay attention to. And once we do that, we have to figure out, well, what does that mean for us? And therefore, what conclusions do we draw and what actions do we take with that group of people that we're involved with? Now, the invisible part of this process tends to be that left side, the left side of the ladder. What is it that influences all the things on the right? Where we come from. I mean, people think this isn't important, but I come from Buffalo. That has a lot to do with the meaning that I make of the world. It really does. I'm a guy, I'm white, I'm of a certain age. All these things have to do with what I pay attention to, the meaning that I make, the conclusions that I draw, and the actions that I take, which is cool. We want to make that available to people for themselves and for others. Because when it's unconscious, we go through that loop and we just pay attention to the things that reinforce the stories that we already have created about the people that we're involved with. When that left side is invisible to us, it's so easy to just seek and gather data that reinforces the conclusions that we already have. So in dialogue, what we're trying to do, one of the things we're trying to do is to give people the opportunity to make visible that left side for themselves, to understand how it influences their process, and then to talk with each other and make it visible to one another across a divide. Because in the heat of threat, when you're feeling threatened, everything gets pretty small, tunnel vision. And that blocks access to our higher brain resources and also our ability to have a wider perception of the people that we're involved with. When I work in organizations, I often find that a large split, like the example that I gave you earlier of the healthcare organization, can start with a small conflict. And the sequence tends to go like this. Somebody experiences a threat. They go into that sense of vigilance mode where they're just paying attention to stuff that might be threatening to them. And they'll either do a preemptive attack or say something defensive, which then provokes and threatens the original person that was the source of the threat. They get vigilant, attack and defend. And now we have a cycle that tends to repeat over and over again. And people start to take sides. And there you have the beginnings of an organization conflict. David Rock is an organization development psychologist in Australia who's studied organization behavior extensively and also married it to his study of interpersonal neurobiology. And he developed this acronym of SCARF specifically for leaders in organizations that are assembling teams that might be under high stress and subject to conflict and division. And it's a way for us to think about what people are looking for when they come into a group environment and what factors can help them have an approach as opposed to an avoid response. So Rock says people scan in 5 social domains for evidence that they should approach or avoid. And they're represented by this acronym SCARF. So the first is status, and that is, where am I going to stand with this group? Am I going to be high or low? Am I going to be pushed out? Am I going to be talked down to? In reflective structured dialogue, we try to address this by doing a lot of work in advance, connecting with advance, greeting people personally, also having time go around so that everybody has an equal amount of time to speak. People are looking for certainty. Do I know what's going to happen when I come into this group? Am I going to be at the mercy of the group dynamic? Or is there an agenda? Is there a plan? So we want to make sure that people know that in advance. A sense of autonomy and agency. Am I going to have input into this? Am I just going to be pushed around by the group or the facilitator? To address that, we ask people to give us their input in advance. I was just consulting today on a dialogue about race that somebody's putting together, and they were just going to drop in and drop the question down. Horrible question, by the way. Can you tell us how you've been hurt by a person in the other race? Great way to start a conversation. Don't do it. So I talked with them about stepping back, getting a lot of input from the people that are going to be involved so that they're part of the process before the conversation happens. The last two, relatedness. That is, am I going to be on the outs here? Is there an in-group, or am I going to be included? And one of the ways that we address that is when Ray talked about those opening questions. We ask questions that invite people to share something that is going to spark curiosity and connection among those who listen. And lastly, fairness. Is the facilitator going to be fair to me, or is the facilitator going to be biased? We assess that by doing our own inner work, like Ray talked about earlier, and also with using structure so that it's less likely that people will experience a lack of fairness to the facilitator.
So why don't we pause and David, anything you think we need to chat about?
Well, we've gotten some really good questions. Let me pose one to you. I think civil discourse is also critical during non-hot topic issues. With that in mind, how do you start a civil discourse with your nonprofit board or leadership within an organization?
So I think I'll take a whack at that. The first step is to have a conversation about what constitutes civil discourse in your organization and what that civil discourse needs to be about. When we think about planning a dialogue, we think in terms of the 6 Ps. Purpose, the people that need to be there to accomplish that purpose, what you want to prevent that's gotten in the way in the past, what you want to promote, either a resource that has been used in the past or new behavior, and then how you help people prepare and what the plan is going to be. And that first piece about what is the purpose of this conversation, to really talk with people about what their hopes might be for conversing about this topic is the first step in doing that. And a clear purpose and a shared purpose are really important before you move forward, because you want to find out whether what the level of interest is in the kind of conversation that you're thinking about, because it may be that not everybody's on the same page. And if they aren't, then you don't want to move forward. Ray, what do you have to add to that?
I kind of wanted to jump on civil discourse. Most of my stories, I am a drama queen, and it's about, all the drama and stuff, but a lot of my work is about with organizations, including not-for-profit, where sometimes the civil discourse is the problem. The people are afraid that if they talk about the issues that are critical, that the organization will disintegrate. And so where I sit, people come to me because they see a problem. And so I've been told we need to have better conversations. Everything feels really glib and surface because I think we are afraid to talk about things that might push us apart. And so defining civil discourse, but also why did you come here? This approach is for having difficult conversations. Share with me your issues and concerns. And oftentimes, again, we unpack it. And so it may be that the discourse is civil, but the polarization, the unresolved issues can lie beneath the civil discourse, and giving people an opportunity to lift those up and put those out there so that we can figure out through the structure and the agreements, how do we help this organization have the conversation they say they have wanted to have for years and years. And we can give it back to you, David. These questions are just, I can't look at them. They are so fascinating. I think we need an additional 3 hours, but I guess that won't happen. What else you got for us?
Well, I don't know if you want to deal with this question now or later, but how do you incorporate this type of training into doctrinal law classes? How do you recommend teaching this to law students? That might be a wrap-up question, but I think that's a key question for this audience.
I'll take what I have done with faculty is teach the principles. And I do have several faculty members that work with me, including one who teaches instructional design and technology. And we adapt the principles and practices to the classroom setting. For example, at the beginning of the class, and this is only one example, they make agreements about what will happen if a conversation becomes difficult. And I guess we don't have the agreements here. I thought we did, but the communication agreements, which are an important part of the dialogue, are things like we'll adhere to the rules about how much time people have. The purpose of the conversation is not to attack, but to get an understanding. How we ask questions of each other. So my experience has been, and I say with great pride that a lot of classrooms at the University of Georgia and universities all over the country, as a result of the work of Essential Partners, Bob Staines, Dave Joseph, part of Essential Partners, we give them the principles and practices, and then they figure out how they want to incorporate them. That's probably very broad, maybe not particularly helpful, but I've just seen so many ways of doing it. And I would be more than happy to share information with anybody who wants to email me and say, tell me more about using this in law school classes, because it is being done, absolutely. Bob, I don't know if you want to take a whack at that question.
No, you're the expert there. Anything else, David?
There's another question. How do you use this in a political policy context? For example, whether to vote or change the name of an upcoming holiday. And that relates to another question that was asked, that was, how do you use this in conversation? Maybe when you're just dialoguing with one person.
So I can tell my John Lewis story, Bob, very quickly. In Georgia, probably 5-6 years ago, elected official referred to John Lewis as a dog, and which is, not a nice thing to say, and got a lot of pushback from some of his constituents, not all. Some of them supported him. I was hired to teach a negotiation class to county commissioners, and God bless his little soul, he was in the class. He immediately came at me and, I want to talk about this. I said, well, that's lovely, but we want to talk about, I'm here to teach negotiation. Very persistent. So I said to him, I will talk to you about the issue. He wanted to talk about guns. I don't know why people want to talk to me about guns, but these are the agreements that you have to make, and this is the structure. And anytime we have a break, and I still don't know why I agreed to this. And so whenever there was a break, if I came out of the bathroom, when I had lunch, there he was. And he followed the agreements. And again, I'll be happy to share any information if someone wants to get it from me. And at the end of that conversation, we talked about guns, but we also talked about what it means to be elected and represent a lot of different people. So the conversation shifted, and it went on forever. And I just want to say to you that at the end of it, he said, Miss Ray, you know, I think maybe I haven't been doing some things right. And I did not say, you think. I rose to the occasion and went, And he said, I wish I had another opportunity to talk to you. And my sister said, what does that mean? And I said, maybe just for a brief and shiny moment, that was a little bit of a shift. And he saw an African-American person as a human being who had some value. And the fact that he was an elected official in a very populous county in Georgia, that was significant. So I hope that was responsive to that question. Maybe I just wanted to tell the story and I forced it to fit. I don't know.
It's a great story, and I think it really does speak very well to that. I'll take a different whack at this. I think that so there's two things here. One is an example of a community that wants to make a decision, but they just go at it too quickly, and they just go right at the policy and wind up splitting people. And an example of this is up here in Massachusetts, in Gloucester, Massachusetts, a couple of years ago. There was a wealthy person who had a sculpture, a big, beautiful outdoor kind of sculpture that they had made, that they donated to the city. And so the city thought, wow, public art. We're just going to put this right out in the middle of town, and won't people love it? Well, no. A lot of people didn't love it. A lot of people were really upset. So they had a public meeting, and with just basically a similar, I'm upset about this, I'm upset about that. And the conflict didn't go away, and there was no policy made until there was a step back. And I think a lot of times what needs to happen in these situations is people need to step back and have a different kind of conversation first. Conversation about what people care about. In Gloucester, they convened dialogues, the spin-off of the old Public Conversations Project. It's called the Gloucester Conversations Project. And they brought people together to talk about what their views are about art, what they care about in public spaces. And after a period of conversations of groups around town, they came together to craft a joint set of decision-making values that would guide them in creating a policy for where to cite this public art. It was cited, and it's now really appreciated by the people of Gloucester, which can be a very contentious town. But it's an example of how stepping back and having a values conversation first, a values dialogue, can inform public policy. And I just want to mention again, sort of like Ray said, if you're interested, I wrote an article about public engagement and deliberation a number of years ago that incorporates dialogue principles into these processes of policymaking. I'm happy to share that with anybody that's interested.
And that's a brilliant segue into our good dialogue questions, because so maybe we can review that and then go back to the art piece and the Confederate monuments, or the statue. Oh Lord, what's the statue in North Carolina that came down? Silent Sam?
I can't remember.
Yeah, some statue. But so why don't we review that and then kind of talk about exactly what you said, Bob. If the question is, and those of you who know mediation, separate positions from interests, remember that, getting to yes? And that's what this does. So standards for good dialogue question. Will the question invite new information, new understanding? So if you ask the question, should we have guns on campus? I don't see anything. The answer is yes or no. What question can help surface something else that would invite new information, new meaning, so that ultimately we will create the guide that will allow us to answer the ultimate question, if we so choose. Does the question have an implicit assumption of right or wrong? That's kind of that question, Bob, on a scale of 1 to 10, how racist are you? Can anyone answer the question speaking from his or her or their own experience? Does it impact the relationship between those responding? Does the question that we're asking, and I will tell you, it can take a month or more to come up with the right question. Does it encourage connection or separation? Does the question invite people to reflect on and share something about themselves, a life experience? Does it exhibit your own internal bias? I love that. Yeah. Does it invite people to think about that and share what's important to them? And I just want to, for a brief aside, a person who took my dialogue course maybe 3 or 4 years ago was part of an organization called Free Radicals, one of the founders, that helps guide groups like Klans, neo-Nazis, hate groups, help guide those people out. And she was saying, these are the kind of questions that we create in our model to help people who decide, I want to move away from this. What are your core values? What's important to you? What kind of world do you want to leave to your children and grandchildren? Not, do you want that Confederate statue on the grounds of the courthouse? What do you want when you think about the people who you want to come into your community? What values do you want them to share? Does the question invite people to share the complexities and nuances of their positions so that they can be understood by others? And I think the clip on the abortion dialogue just said that so beautifully, that my understanding is that no one changed sides after all of those conversations, but they became connected and cared about each other as human beings. And that's critical. Does the question avoid asking people to analyze, hypothesize, or try to find the right answer? And that can be really challenging in some situations where you say, I want a question that helps people follow a logical path. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn, but this is not about the logical path. This is about connecting to another human being who may have a different worldview from you, different values from you. But for whatever reason, be it in the classroom, the person across the street with that sign in their yard, the person on the board of education who represents the people on the right side of the track versus the left side of the track. Does the question avoid labeling people or putting them into boxes? And does it invite people to discuss things that are important to them? I think Bob did a great job in describing that, something meaningful to them. And those are the standards for asking good dialogue questions. So if you think about monuments, and I'm participating in a dialogue about prayer in a public space, and I cannot get the mayor to help craft a question that does not involve the word prayer. And it's a challenge. It's like, what kind of prayer would you want to have? Now, with mayor, let's kind of back up. And Bob, you help me with this. Why do you think people want to pray? Well, my church tells me this. Okay, one of the things you said to me was that you want this community to be welcoming to all. So there are people who don't go to church. There are people who have other faiths, people who are comfortable not believing in a higher power. Again, if we think about the purpose of prayer, perhaps we can craft a question that can begin to explore what value does prayer bring into that space, and maybe talk about other ways you can create that value that involves more than prayer. Bob, you want to say anything about that? I may have been a little less artful than I wanted to be.
I doubt that, but I'm going to take a little bit of a different slant just in terms of relating it to the context. A few years ago, I was teaching at Pepperdine Law, and when I started talking about these kinds of standards for questions, one person raised their hand and said, you're teaching us to do exactly the opposite of what we're being taught to do in the rest of our training. I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, because I don't know enough about legal training. But out of that conversation that resulted from that, we hatched a sort of a way of distinguishing kinds of questions. And I think of some of the questions that we traditionally use are what I would call questions of interrogation, right? And these are all questions of invitation. These are questions that invite people to say something that will help them to be more fully known by the other people in the room. So if you don't remember any of the specifics of these things, keep in mind questions for invitation, the answers to which will help people be more fully known by the other people in the room and will spark curiosity to know more about that person. So if I, for instance, I was working in Taiwan a few years ago, and we started a dialogue with a typical experience question that we use here in the States. Tell us about a personal experience you've had, blah, blah, blah. And my host said, you can't do that here. That question will not work here because people can't speak for themselves. So we created this question about, can you tell us something about a wise person in your life that influenced the values that you hold dear, right? And I mention this to say, for the purpose of saying that the answers to those questions were my grandfather, my father, my pastor, my wife. All of these people that responded brought other people into the room that were important to them. And then the people listening who had a grandfather would go to the person that talked about their grandfather and say, yeah, my grandfather wasn't like your grandfather, but he was a grandfather and I want to know more. And all of a sudden the room is alive with connection, where when people came into the room, it was really dead with division.
David, you see anything else you think we're kind of running out of time, which is fine.
If you're speaking, David, we can't hear you.
Oh, there are some really good questions. There's a question about, can you do this without a facilitator and without learning agreements and a program? And as a novice, I know that without learning agreements, this isn't going to go very far. But I think the question more is for someone who's a teacher, how do they go about doing it? And what parts are really necessary for a teacher to bring this into their classes?
Shall I start?
Yeah, you should.
Okay. So
should.
I think learning agreements, communication agreements, I would say a standard dialogue is an hour up to 2 hours. You can't do that when you have 90 minutes of content for your class, but you can overlay in a classroom what we will do if we hit a wall and have a difficult conversation. That's one thing based on communication agreements and structure. But sometimes I've known faculty members that have just kind of moved their whole class in a dialogic model where they spend time crafting the right questions and getting students to use the structure and agreements to respond to the questions, to ask each other questions of genuine curiosity. Social work. The folk I know who are doing it in law school are using it when they seem that there's an issue or a concern, but there, as I said before, lots of ways that you can use the structure, the communication agreements, the questions of curiosity to reframe the learning teaching experience. And what I'm hearing is it changes things so much. One of the things I'm hearing at the University of Georgia, and I believe it's happening everywhere, that students are becoming more polarized and more influenced by their parents. And I've heard from the housing here and student affairs that they never seen anything like that. And so even in those spaces and in the classroom, just saying, when this happens, this is how we will shift so that we can have the conversation we need to have. Also, I have a person who teaches teachers, and she in her classroom, they focus on difficult conversations in the educational field. And she talks about the power of having in her class people with very different experience, people from wealthy backgrounds versus people who are first generation college from poor backgrounds, and helping uncover the assumptions by asking the right questions, oftentimes in the first day of class, so that they kind of set up a framework so people know that in this classroom, we have an approach and a way of talking about things where people feel safe and safe enough, because I think anyone guarantees a safe space is feeling a little grandiose, but safe enough. And if we hit a bad spot, we know we can pause, or as my friend says, sometimes we have to say, we're going to do a Zoom call. It's extracurricular, but we need to talk about this. The issue of microaggressions keeps popping up. To me, that's a very difficult conversation. I've had, I can say without exaggerating, 8 calls in the past 2 weeks where faculty members want to talk. How do we teach a class when we're worried about what we say and how we frame things? And we don't understand this. Or one Black person will say, this makes sense to me. Another one says, this doesn't make sense to me. How do we create a space that all perspectives and points of view can be heard, and we can continue, we can connect to one another, learn and grow?
Let me throw 2 cents in on that. A way that I like to think of this is you often just can't take this whole process and plop it down in a classroom. You don't have time. So you have to think in terms of what I think a lot of metaphor. I think of islands of dialogue. So can you mark out a space and say, you know, we're going to step on the island right now, you know, metaphorically, we're going to have a dialogic moment here. And we're going to use questions, presumably you've done some teaching about those questions that can draw people out. And I do think you have to have some agreements. And I think that this really can work even just in a little mini conversation. Give you a quick example. I was driving my daughter to Chicago a couple weeks ago, and I said something that really offended her. And I think we rode in silence from Cleveland to Toledo. Until she asked a wonderful question. She stepped back and she said, I wondered what the meaning of that was for you, Dad. It was a little interaction. It only involved one question, but it totally unlocked this difficult situation that I created. And I think that can happen in the classroom too, when people are taught how to ask those questions. And then you step into the point where you say, here, we're going to have this dialogic moment about this particular issue for the next 10 minutes. And I think we're getting close to our time. So I want to make sure we maybe get another question in there.
I'd like to combine 2 questions. One person wrote me, tell them that learning often involves being uncomfortable with the conversation. And I think that goes to the title of the program, Brave Listening. And that also relates to another questions, if I can push them together, of how does this apply in families? Surveys show that families have more trouble talking and problems around the dinner table. I don't know if you can combine those 2, but I think brave listening is something maybe you both want to comment on and is part of this.
I think in the topics that are hot, people come with plenty of discomfort. The topics that we deal with, people are already having a very difficult time. And we can use some of the techniques that we're talking with you about are all techniques that have been drawn from family therapy. They're interrupting dysfunctional patterns by trying something new and structured to stop the old and invite something new to take root. So because this comes from family therapy, it works really well in families.
Yes, I can't add anything to that. So I think we're there, 529, right?
That's right. If I could jump in and ask one question, and I hope that this will be a brief one, but given the trend in the country, how do we encourage civil discourse conversations at scale? In other words, how do we maybe reverse the trend that we're seeing with polarization and people unable to have conversations about these topics? What are your thoughts there?
Teach reflective structured dialogue and learn reflective structured dialogue, because we really have to, from my perspective, create a space so that people can unlearn. And the only way you can unlearn something is with structure. And this model, this approach provides that structure. We got a lot of unlearning to do.
I'm not sure what the solution to that is. It's one of those really wicked and big problems. What I will say is that until we see the cost, the relational cost, and the consequence to community life of the kind of polarization that we've been experiencing, I don't have a whole lot of hope for change. I think that the cost needs to be really seen and felt.
One final thought. Several participants have asked for your emails, Bob and Ray. I don't know if you could send them out by chat, but people want to follow up, get references, get the PowerPoints. Yeah. So if you could put those out by chat to all the participants, and if you can't, I probably can.
Doing it right now.
Well, thank you. This has been an incredible conversation. Really appreciate y'all taking on this task of helping us learn how to engage civilly with each other. So I certainly enjoyed it, and I know the panelists did based on the conversation that was going on in chat. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Sorry.
Thanks so much for having us. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, David.
Take care.
Thank the audience too.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Before we sign off, I just wanted to remind everyone that tomorrow we start a little bit different schedule. We will be starting our leadership lessons from the military panel tomorrow at 10 o'clock Eastern, 9 Central, 8 Mountain, and 7 Pacific. We have an incredible panel of JAGs from the Navy, Army, and Air Force. And so I hope that you will join for that conversation, because I expect it to be fascinating. So with that, thank you for joining today for these engaging conversations, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
David and Ray, you still on?
I'm here.
Ray? Ray's gone. I was hoping we could do a quick debrief.
Yeah.
I'll try to grab Ray and get back to you.
I just want to say, whoops.
Oh, I'm here.
I just wanted to say, Bernie Hirsch is my first cousin. And that was the only reason